Somebody's mother sliced cold cornmeal mush, dropped it into a skillet of bacon grease, and called it Tuesday dinner. That dish is one of 100 on this list that most American kitchens stopped making before the century turned. You will hear about fried potatoes and onions that fed 5 people for the cost of a single fast food meal today. A pot of soup beans cooked so long the broth held a spoon upright, and a flour gravy poured over day-old biscuits made by a woman who never owned a measuring cup and never needed one. These meals came from hollows and hilltops where the nearest store was an hour down a gravel road, and every last thing in the pantry had a job to do. Here are 100 forgotten hillbilly dinners that have faded into history. Tomato gravy started the same way sawmill gravy did. Bacon drippings in a hot skillet, a spoonful of flour stirred in. But where sawmill gravy reached for milk, tomato gravy reached for the canning jar. Home canned tomatoes, crushed by hand into the roux, turned the gravy a deep orange red and gave it a sweetness that the pepper-heavy sawmill version never had. A pinch of sugar went in if the tomatoes were too sharp, and the gravy cooked down until it was thick enough to sit on a split biscuit without running off the edges. Across the rural South through the 1940s and 50s, tomato gravy was breakfast, served alongside whatever the kitchen could produce: eggs if the hens were laying, a slice of cured ham if the smokehouse still had one. The color told you what kind of morning it was. Pale gravy meant milk was plentiful. Red gravy meant the cow had gone dry and the tomatoes were filling in. Chicken and slick dumplings were the mountain way of turning one bird into a feast that fed everyone around the table. A single chicken simmered down into a rich broth that filled the house with the smell of Sunday comfort. Thin dumplings rolled by hand replaced fancy noodles, soaking up every drop of flavor and thickening the stew into a creamy, heartwarming dish. The bits of tender chicken floated among the slick dumplings like treasure pieces in gravy. This was not a meal of plenty, but one of patience, pride, and clever hands. Appalachian cooks knew how to stretch what they had until it felt like abundance. Steam rose from the pot like a promise that no one would go hungry tonight. Every bowl felt earned, heavy, and satisfying in the way only home cooking can be. The leftovers, if any, tasted richer by morning. Chicken and slick dumplings turned scarcity into celebration, hardship into comfort, and hunger into harmony. It was food for body and soul alike. Even today, that first spoonful carries the same truth. It does not take much to make a meal worth remembering when it is made with care and love. Number 22. Pinto beans simmered all afternoon. This is the dinner that runs the rest of the list, because the pot sits at the back of the stove from 1 in the afternoon until 5 and asks for almost nothing. A cup of dry pintos soaked since the night before, cold water just over the top of the beans, a piece of streaked side meat about the length of a thumb, a quartered onion. No salt at the start, because salt at the start keeps the bean skin tight, and a tight skin will not let the broth in. The pot goes on the stove with the burner turned so low that one bubble breaks the surface every 10 seconds. That is the rate, and it does not change for 3 hours. The kitchen begins to smell of pork and onion at the 2nd hour, and by the 3rd, the broth has turned the color of strong tea. Salt goes in only at the end, and a slosh of vinegar goes in with it. The beans come off the heat and rest in their own broth for 15 minutes before the first spoonful, because the bean keeps cooking on the way to the bowl. A half cup of dry pintos makes 2 suppers for 1 person. The leftover beans the next day are better than the first, and the broth is what most people overlook, because the broth is where the whole pot put itself. A wedge of cornbread crumbled and turns the bowl into a meal that no restaurant in any city has ever quite produced. A senior in Hancock County, Tennessee, who has been doing this since 1956, will say that the pot teaches patience to the person who tends it, and that patience is the missing ingredient in modern cooking. The dish is one of the cheapest in the American repertoire, and at the same time, it is the most filling. That is the trick the cookbooks never quite captured, because the trick is the time. Number 16. Selling the raw cream skimmed off the morning milk. Every milk cow in the hollow gave more than one family could drink, so the thick yellow cream got skimmed, churned, or carried down the road to a neighbor or a relative across the county line. It never saw a pasteurizer in its life, and that was the whole point. Here is why that jar of homemade cream could never be sold today. In August of 1987, the Food and Drug Administration finalized a regulation, codified at 21 CFR 1240.61, requiring that all milk and milk products in final packaged form be pasteurized before they cross state lines for human consumption. The agency had spent years tracking outbreaks tied to raw milk and concluded that pasteurizing was the only reliable way to make it safe. So the unpasteurized cream that the hook of this list promised, the kind the Hill Country Kitchen ran on, is now barred from interstate sale by federal law. A neighborly swap across the county line is no longer a neighborly thing at all. By the way, real quick before we keep counting down, if your own people cook this way and you want to keep a few of these old Hill Country dishes alive in your own kitchen, we have pulled the safe, legal versions together into a vintage recipe guide. There is a link waiting for you down in the description. Now, back to the list. Whole hog shoulder with crackling bread was Christmas feast requiring community effort, turning December butchering into celebration. Mountain families raised hogs specifically for Christmas slaughter, feeding them all year. The shoulder was large enough to feed extended family, fatty enough to stay moist during long cooking. It was seasoned with salt and pepper, then slow roasted over hickory coals in outdoor pits men tended throughout Christmas Eve night. Fat rendered slowly, creating crispy bark outside while inside stayed tender. Women saved cracklings, crispy rendered pork fat bits, to mix into cornbread batter. The crackling bread baked in cast iron skillets, top golden and crunchy. In rural Georgia, Arkansas, and Mississippi, this meant Christmas smelling like wood smoke for miles. Families gathered around outdoor fires, sharing whiskey and stories while meat cooked through cold night. The finished shoulder pulled apart easily, juice running into crackling bread. Venison backstrap with wild mushroom gravy was Christmas luxury harvested from November hunts and preserved for holiday feast. The backstrap was the tenderest deer cut, saved specifically for Christmas when families wanted something special. Hunters took their best bucks in late fall, field-dressed properly, and hung meat in cold sheds where December temperatures kept it fresh. The backstrap was sliced thick, seasoned with salt and pepper, then seared quickly in hot cast iron to keep inside pink and tender. Wild mushrooms gathered in fall and dried were reconstituted and cooked into rich gravy using pan drippings, creating earthy depth complementing venison. In mountain communities, venison Christmas meant rifle skill, understanding deer movement, and respect for animals giving lives to feed families. This wasn't bought meat, but earned through cold mornings in tree stands. The backstrap melted on tongue, flavor clean and sweet. Families served it with potatoes and beans. Number 19. The apple butter and hot biscuit. Every fall in the Appalachian Hills, families gathered around a copper kettle set over an open fire and stirred apples for hours. The apples cooked down with cinnamon, cloves, and a little sugar until they turned into a thick, dark spread that tasted like autumn had been concentrated into a jar. The stirring was the hard part. You used a long wooden paddle and you never stopped, because if the apple butter scorched on the bottom, the whole batch was ruined. Some families kept the fire going from dawn until after dark. Children took turns with the paddle. Neighbors came over to help and stayed for supper. The apple butter went into mason jars and lined the shelves of the root cellar, and it lasted all winter. When you split a hot biscuit straight from the oven and spread that dark apple butter across the steaming inside, the heat from the biscuit loosened the spices and the whole kitchen smelled like October. It was the simplest sandwich in the world, bread and fruit. But the fruit had been transformed by 12 hours of stirring, and the bread had been made by hand that same morning, and together they carried the weight of an entire season's labor. You could buy apple butter in a jar at the store by the 1970s, but it was not the same. The store version was thinner, sweeter, and missing the smokiness that came from cooking outdoors over hardwood coals. The real thing required a community, a fire, and a full day of work, and that is exactly why it disappeared. Nobody has that kind of time anymore, but the people who remember it will tell you that no sandwich since has tasted half as good. Number 15. Canning 365 jars of green beans every summer. The smell of vinegar and steam in an Appalachian kitchen in August was the smell of survival being put up by the quart. Your great-grandmother stood in a hot kitchen for 10 days every summer, snapping beans on the porch by morning, blanching them in a black canner by 10, packing ball jars by noon, and lowering them into a boiling water bath that ran until dark. 365 jars, one a day for the year. The math was the year. The part most people forget is that the jars were not extra. They were the budget. She used a pressure cooker she had bought in 1949 for $11, jars she washed every season, and lids she bought for 49 cents at the IGA. Her husband cut the wood that fired the stove. Her oldest daughter washed jars in scalding water. Her youngest carried the canner to the porch. Every jar she sealed was a winter night that would have a vegetable on the plate. The seller held them by row, by date, by category, and a handwritten ledger pinned to the door tracked what came in and what went out. By April, the rows were empty and the gardens were going back in. The ledger was your family budget for the cold months, written in jars instead of dollars. Today, a can of green beans at the grocery costs you around $1.50, while a home canned quart runs about 30 cents to put up. 300 jars is $450 in winter food your family does not have to buy. Every Appalachian woman who stood in that hot kitchen knew the arithmetic of August. Real quick before number 14, if any of these tricks remind you of your grandmother's kitchen, I put together a recipe guide with more dishes built the same way. The cornbread, the soup beans, the dried apples, the milk gravy. The link is right below this video. Number 15, coffee soup over crumbled biscuit. Here is the part of the list where some of you are about to think I am making it up. I am not. Coffee soup was a real dessert, eaten in real kitchens across the southern mountains for 3 generations, and for many older Appalachian people, it is still the taste that means home. A cold leftover biscuit, a bowl, a pour of hot coffee, thinned with warm milk from the cow, sweetened with a heaped teaspoon of sugar, or a thick drizzle of sorghum. A grown man ate it at the end of the evening meal. A child was given a small cup of it before bed on a cold winter night. Here is what I want you to see, and this is the thing most modern people miss. Coffee soup was not a joke, and it was not a hardship trick. It was a comfort. A bitter grown-up drink, softened with milk and sugar, poured over the last piece of something their mother had baked that morning. An old man in Letcher County, interviewed for a Foxfire oral history in 1977, said he ate coffee soup 4 times a week for 60 years. He never once thought of it as poor. He thought of it as his. These small, strange desserts were the taste of a specific life. They were not reminders that a family had little. They were reminders that a family had each other at a table, at the end of a hard day, with a warm cup and a piece of bread. That is the whole sermon of Hillbilly sweet making, and you will find it under every item on this list if you look close enough. The only thing between your family and a 15-degree night was a few inches of mud packed between logs. Chinking was a fall chore as certain as hog killing. You mixed red clay with water, sometimes binding it with straw or animal hair, and pressed it into every gap the wind had widened since summer. Some folks used creek moss. Others swore by clay and wood ash that dried harder than mortar. The old women ran a hand along the wall and felt the draft before you ever saw the crack. Inside, the worst gaps got sealed with strips of newspaper pasted over with flour and water paste, or rags soaked in tallow. A well-chinked cabin held heat from one fireplace in a room large enough for 8. You learned the quality of the work on the first cold night, lying under quilts, listening for the whistle that meant someone missed a spot. Number 19, Salisbury steak TV dinner. 1 ground beef patty in dark brown gravy, a scoop of mashed potatoes, a square of corn, and a brownie compartment sealed in an aluminum tray and slid into a Swanson box. Swanson introduced its Salisbury steak dinner in 1962. By the middle of the decade, frozen TV dinners were on the menu in millions of American homes once or twice a week, eaten on metal trays in front of Bonanza or The Ed Sullivan Show. Families stopped trying to make Salisbury steak from scratch because the frozen one came out the same every time. The homemade version, a Wednesday night patty smothered in mushroom gravy, faded inside 10 years. When TV dinners faded in the 1980s, the dish faded with them. The brownie compartment was the first thing the kids ate and the last thing anyone remembers. You can still buy a Salisbury steak frozen dinner today, but the gravy tastes like a copy of a copy. The same hands that fed that starter also rendered the fat. Every fall, when hog killing time came, the women cut the leaf fat from around the kidneys and the back fat from under the skin, chopped it into small pieces, and melted it down slow in a heavy pot until the kitchen filled with a smell that was equal parts rich and animal. The cracklings left behind, those crisp brown bits of rendered tissue, went straight into cornbread batter or got eaten warm with salt right off the stove. Lard was the only cooking fat most poor families could afford, and it made pie crusts that shattered at the touch of a fork and biscuits so flaky they barely held together. Doctors spent 40 years telling people to stop using it. Margarine and vegetable shortening replaced it on store shelves. Now, heritage lard sells for $15 a jar at specialty markets, and pastry chefs swear nothing else produces the same crust. The grandmothers who rendered it in their yards for free would have laughed themselves breathless. Number 21. Hamburger gravy on biscuits. You browned ground beef in a skillet, sprinkled flour over the meat, and stirred in milk until you had a thick, pale gravy studded with crumbled hamburger. Salt, pepper, and nothing else. Then you split open a hot biscuit and spooned the gravy over both halves until it ran down the sides and pooled on the plate. Some families used canned biscuits, others made them from scratch with lard and buttermilk. Either way, the meal took 15 minutes from cold skillet to table. This was payday -3 food. The kind of supper that used one ingredient stretched with flour and milk into something that stuck to your ribs and kept you full through the night. Men who worked road crews and factory floors ate this twice a week without complaint. It filled the same hole a roast would have filled at a fraction of the cost. In most American homes in the 1950s, dinner was not a decision. It was a schedule. Monday was meatloaf. Tuesday was something from a can. Wednesday was whatever the butcher had marked down. Thursday was leftovers rearranged into a casserole. Friday was fish if you were Catholic and pancakes if you were not. Saturday was hamburgers or hot dogs. Sunday was the only meal anyone planned with any real intention. Nobody scrolled through recipes. Nobody asked the family what they were in the mood for. The woman running that kitchen knew what she had in the refrigerator and how far she could stretch it until payday. That rotation was not boring. It was a system built on knowing exactly what you could afford and making it last. The meals on this list came out of that rotation. They were never exciting. They were always there. The sound was different depending on what you were washing. Cotton shirts made a brisk scraping, short strokes, working with the weave. Denim moved slower, pressed harder, a lower sound that meant your wrists were in it. You never used a circular motion on anything you wanted to keep the shape of. You learned this not from instructions but from ruining things. A collar torn off a school shirt, a flannel that thinned to gauze after 2 seasons. By the time you were trusted with the washboard alone, you already knew which section of the board she used for collars and which for knees, and how she shifted her weight on a heavy piece. Glass washboards, preferred for finer fabrics because the smoother surface was gentler than zinc metal, were standard in many Appalachian households through the 1940s. Nobody explained the difference between the glass and the zinc board. You watched long enough and then you simply knew, the way you knew which pot she used for beans and which she never touched for anything else. Number 12. Canned chili over saltines. Open the can, heat it in a pot for a few minutes, pour it into a bowl, and crumble a fistful of saltine crackers on top. The crackers soaked up the liquid at the edges while keeping a little crunch toward the center. A single can filled one person, and 2 cans handled a family without complaint. Add a slice of white bread on the side and you had a hot dinner on the table before anyone could suggest driving somewhere instead. In households where the grocery run had not happened and nobody intended to make it happen tonight, a can of chili and a sleeve of saltines was the unspoken agreement between exhaustion and hunger. The chili was thick and salty, and the crackers gave each spoonful just enough texture to make the bowl feel like more than it was. Sawmill gravy got its name in the lumber camps of the late 1800s, where cooks fed crews of men using nothing but flour, grease, milk, and black pepper in quantities large enough to fill a washtub. The gravy was thick, pale, peppery, and poured over anything that held still: biscuits, toast, cornbread, fried potatoes. You started with a few spoonfuls of bacon drippings in a hot skillet, stirred in flour until it turned golden and smelled like toasted grain, then poured in milk slowly while scraping the bottom of the pan. The whole process took less than 10 minutes and fed a household for pennies. Some cooks called it bulldog gravy, and in the coal camps of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, it showed up at every meal: breakfast, dinner, and supper, because the mines paid low and the company store charged high. The pepper had to bite. If you couldn't feel the pepper, the gravy wasn't finished. She made it by sound. The sizzle of flour hitting grease told her everything a recipe never could. Fried green tomatoes with cornmeal crust were the South's way of saying waste nothing, because even an unripe tomato could still shine. When the vines hung heavy with fruit that would not turn red in time, thrifty hands sliced them thick, dusted them in cornmeal, and dropped them into sizzling bacon grease. The kitchen came alive with that familiar pop and crackle, the sound of hunger about to be satisfied. The slices fried golden and crisp, tart inside and smoky outside, a perfect blend of garden freshness and skillet comfort. They were often served beside beans, greens, or gravy, completing a meal that cost almost nothing but tasted like plenty. Each bite carried the flavor of hard work, sunshine, and summer's patience. Mothers never measured. They just knew when the batter was right, and kids learned to flip them when the edges turned brown. Fried green tomatoes were proof that nothing in the South went to waste. Not time, not food, not love. They were simple, dependable, and unforgettable. The first bite snapped with tang. The last ended in quiet satisfaction. In every kitchen that made them, thrift became art, and every plate told the same story: make do and make it delicious. Number 27. Soup beans and skillet cornbread. A cup of dry pinto beans soaked overnight, then simmered all day with a chunk of smoked ham hock, an onion, and water that just covers them. By supper time, the broth has thickened on its own and turned the color of a strong tea. A wedge of cornbread crumbled in is the only addition. The dish scales down without effort. 1 cup of dry beans yields 4 single suppers, and the pot reheats better on the second day than the first. Sydney Saylor Farr put it at the center of her 1983 book on mountain cooking, and Loyal Jones wrote that the smell of the pot was what a hill country grandmother smelled like on a Saturday evening. For a senior eating alone in a hill country kitchen, no other dinner returns this much warmth for so few coins. Number 22. Cooking the wild songbirds off your own back porch. Picture yourself in a 1950s hill kitchen in late fall. Money is thin, the smokehouse is nearly empty, and the dogwoods outside are full of fat little birds gorging on berries before the cold sets in. Your grandfather hands you a slingshot or a fine net, and you go to work the way his people always did. You bring in a string of robins, maybe a few cedar waxwings or a brace of doves, and you pluck them at the kitchen table while the grease heats. You roll the little breasts in seasoned flour, drop them into the skillet, and in a few minutes you have a platter of crisp brown morsels that taste of the wild. You serve them over biscuits with the pan gravy poured on top, and nobody in that kitchen thinks they have done a single thing wrong because the woods were the pantry and a bird in the pot was just supper. Now here is what no one mentions when they romanticize that kind of self-reliance. Almost every one of those birds is protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, a law that makes it unlawful to pursue, take, capture, kill, or possess nearly 1,100 species without a federal permit. It does not matter whether the bird is alive or dead, whole or plucked. It does not matter that you ate it instead of mounting it. If you did today exactly what that grandfather taught you to do, you could face up to 6 months in jail and a fine reaching $15,000, and the game wardens could seize the very net you used. Robins, waxwings, and most of the small birds that once filled a lean seasoned skillet sit firmly on the protected list. The trick that once stretched a poor family through November is now one of the clearest lines in the whole countdown. Salt-cured country ham was Christmas luxury taking months to create and symbolizing prosperity through patience. These weren't store hams, but whole hog legs cured in salt, then hung in smokehouses through fall and winter. The curing began in November, with fresh hams rubbed with salt and sometimes sugar, drawing out moisture and preserving meat without refrigeration. By Christmas, hams developed deep mahogany exteriors and concentrated salty sweet flavor unlike anything modern. The ham was soaked overnight to remove excess salt, then baked slowly with brown sugar glaze, creating caramelized crust. Sliced thin, the meat was intensely flavorful, salty, smoky, rich, requiring only biscuits and red-eye gravy. In Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, country ham represented wealth and foresight, since families began curing in fall for Christmas. The smell of ham baking filled houses Christmas morning. This wasn't bought but made food, requiring knowledge of salt ratios and smoking. Number 16. Streak-o-lean on white bread. Streak-o-lean was the cheap cut of salt-cured pork belly that ran more fat than meat, just thin streaks of lean running through thick layers of white. You sliced it, fried it slow in its own grease until the edges curled and crisped, and laid it on a piece of white bread. The bread soaked up the drippings and went soft and almost translucent where the grease touched it. This was a supper sandwich in rural Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolina Piedmont, where streak-o-lean cost half what bacon cost and lasted twice as long in the smokehouse. It was saltier than bacon and fattier than side meat, and people who grew up eating it will tell you it tasted better than both of them put together. You could argue that every sandwich on this list was born from the same arithmetic. Take what you have, divide it by the number of mouths at the table, and figure out how to make the answer feel like enough. That is not a recipe. That is survival math, and the women who ran it in their heads every day did not call it that. They called it Tuesday. They called it getting by. The Hillbilly sandwich was never meant to impress anybody. It was meant to solve a problem that showed up 3 times a day, every single day, for decades. The fact that some of them tasted extraordinary was almost accidental. Flavor was a byproduct of necessity, not the goal. The goal was another day where everybody ate. Number 21. Stretching whole milk with water and powdered milk. The smell of cold milk mixing with warm carnation powder filled every coal camp kitchen the night before payday. A box of Carnation Instant Non-Fat Dry Milk from the IGA cost 95 cents and made 8 quarts, while a gallon of fresh pet whole milk at the company store ran 75 cents. Your grandmother poured the fresh milk into a pitcher, added cold water and a half cup of dry powder, stirred it with a long-handled spoon, and slid the pitcher into the icebox overnight. By morning, the children could not tell the difference, and that was the whole reason of the trick. The cereal still got cold milk. The biscuits still got buttermilk poured the way they always had. The gravy still set up the same. Today, a gallon of whole milk costs around $4, and the math still cuts your milk bill in half. It was not a secret because anyone hid it. It was a secret because the children were not supposed to find out. Number 20. Peanut butter potato candy. Here is a candy that began as 2 ingredients and stayed that way for 80 years. 1 cold, boiled potato, 2 cups of powdered sugar worked in by hand until a white dough came together under your palms. You rolled it out thin on a floured board, spread peanut butter over the whole sheet, rolled it up like a jelly roll, cut it into coins, pinwheels of brown and white, sweet enough to set your teeth aching. A single potato, a 2-pound bag of sugar from the company store, and a jar of peanut butter made enough candy for a church social of 50. Mrs. Nora Lewis of Mingo County, West Virginia, made it every Christmas Eve from 1944 until 1989. Her grandchildren still fight over the recipe card. 4 lines long. One of them has it framed. Long before anyone had a working refrigerator in the mountains, families in Mitchell County, North Carolina, were pulling their cabbages in mid-October and flipping them upside down into freshly plowed furrows. They called it holing it up. Dig a row, set each head root side up, Turn another furrow of dirt right over the top and walk away. The frozen ground drew moisture out slowly, and those tough outer leaves became a natural wrapper that kept the inside crisp all winter. When the thaw came, you dug up a head that tasted fresher than anything from a jar. Your grandmother made slaw from it in the dead of January, and that impossible crunch, in a season of soft, mushy canned vegetables, was worth every bit of the October labor. The women who knew how deep to set those heads never wrote a word of it down. Number 21, chicken a la king in pastry shells. Diced cooked chicken folded into a sherry cream sauce with mushrooms, pimientos, and green peas ladled into a Pepperidge Farm puff pastry shell that you pulled out of the freezer that morning. It was the dish a hostess made when the boss came over. It was also what showed up at every wedding reception, club dinner, and junior league luncheon between 1955 and 1969. The writer Calvin Trillin once wondered in print where it had gone, because for 2 decades it was everywhere. Convenience killed it. By the 1980s, the pastry shells were hard to find and the sherry felt fussy. The recipe sits in 70-year-old binders, splashed and yellowed, waiting for a hostess who is not coming back. You will not find it on a restaurant menu in any major city. You will find it tucked inside a church cookbook from Indianapolis printed in 1968. The garden was not a hobby. It was the difference between eating and not eating. Every house had one: tomatoes, pole beans, squash, sweet corn, potatoes, cucumbers, peppers, laid out in rows that followed the same pattern your grandfather used because he knew which plants grew well beside each other and which ones stole from the soil. The kids weeded. Everybody weeded. You did not complain about it because the alternative was visible from the kitchen window every time the beans started to climb. In summer, the table was nothing but garden food: sliced tomatoes still warm from the vine, corn boiled in the husk, cucumbers soaking in ice water and vinegar. Now raised bed garden kits cost $400, and farm-to-table restaurants charge a premium for produce that traveled fewer miles than your grandfather walked to check on his butter beans. He would not have understood the phrase. The table was 10 steps from the garden. Number 15. Ham and lima bean casserole. Leftover ham cut into cubes, frozen lima beans, and a can of cream of mushroom soup. You mixed everything together in a baking dish, topped it with buttered breadcrumbs, and baked it until the edges bubbled. The mushroom soup was the sauce, which meant you did not need to make a roux or measure anything beyond opening a can. Lima beans were everywhere in the 1950s. They showed up in casseroles, soups, and side dishes because they were cheap and available frozen year-round. Most children hated them. Most mothers served them anyway. This casserole was the dinner nobody asked for and nobody complained about. It filled the plate, it used up the ham, and it was done in 40 minutes. By the late 1950s, frozen dinners started showing up in grocery stores, and the promise was hard to resist. A full meal on a tray, ready in 20 minutes, no planning required. Swanson put a turkey dinner in an aluminum tray and called it a television dinner, and within a few years, the entire idea of cooking from scratch on a weeknight started to feel old-fashioned. The meals on this list did not disappear because they tasted bad. They disappeared because they took time, and time was the one thing the modern kitchen was designed to eliminate. A casserole that baked for an hour lost to a tray that heated in 20 minutes. A soup that simmered all afternoon lost to a can that opened in 2 seconds. The trade was speed for flavor, and most families made it without looking back. What they gave up was not just a recipe. It was the smell of a kitchen that had been working all day. Saturday afternoons, she made the starch. Not from a can, from a cup of wheat flour stirred into cold water until smooth, then drizzled slowly into a pot of boiling water and stirred until it thickened to the consistency of thin gravy. It cost nothing because flour was already in the kitchen, and it worked on cotton collars and church blouses as well as anything that ever came in commercial packaging. The trick was concentration. Too thick, and the iron dragged and scorched. Too thin, and the collar wilted before noon. She knew it by how the liquid fell off the spoon. The garment was dipped, wrung out gently, hung to dry part way, then ironed while still slightly damp. the only way the starch set properly and held through a full day. Appalachian women had been making wheat starch this way since before the Civil War, and the practice held in mountain households well into the 1960s, where commercial spray starch wasn't worth the expense. What the store eventually sold in a blue aerosol can, she made in a pot in 20 minutes. Number 21. Cold plate supper. No stove, no oven, no skillet. Just a plate set out on the table with sliced lunch meat, a few slices of cheese, a handful of crackers, some pickle spears, and whatever fruit was sitting on the counter. In some houses it was called a snack plate. In others it was called a lazy supper. But the woman who set it on the table did not call it anything at all. She just put it down and sat down next to it. This was the dinner that happened on the hottest nights in July and August, when turning on a burner felt like cruelty, or on evenings after a funeral or a long drive home from a hospital visit, when cooking was the last thing on anyone's mind. Everything on the plate was ready to eat straight from the package. Nobody heated anything, nobody washed a pan, and everybody got fed. Nobody planned these suppers. That was the honest truth of it. The women who made them had spent the day working a counter or a desk, or running after children, or standing on their feet at a job that did not care how tired they were when 5 o'clock came. They came home and opened the refrigerator and made a decision in about 4 seconds. Not what sounds good, not what the family deserves, just what is fast and what will fill them up. These meals did not come from ambition. They came from the ordinary exhaustion of keeping a household alive when the world expected you to do it quietly, without complaint, and without anyone noticing what it cost you. Every family had a version of this night, and every family pretended it happened less often than it did. If salmon patties came from a factory can, leather breeches came from the porch ceiling. Whole green beans, strung on thread and hung to dry in the open air until they shriveled into tough, leathery strips that could last through an entire winter without refrigeration. The Cherokee had been drying beans on rawhide cord for centuries before Appalachian settlers adopted the practice and renamed them leather breeches for the way the dried pods looked like miniature trouser legs. You rehydrated them by soaking overnight, then simmered them low and slow with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock until the beans softened and the broth turned dark and smoky. Some mountain families called them shucky beans. Same method, different hollow, different name for the same memory. The dried beans developed a concentrated, almost umami depth that fresh green beans could never match, and the old women who strung them every August swore the flavor came from the mountain air itself. Nobody strings leather breeches on the porch anymore. The taste of slow-dried August is gone with the hands that hung them. Rabbit and dumplings was a meal that tasted like effort and reward mixed together, the kind that carried the story of the hunt straight to the supper table. Catching the rabbit was only half the work. The rest was done slow and steady in the kitchen. The meat was browned, simmered in broth until tender, and dropped into bubbling stock where floury dumplings waited to soak up every drop of flavor. Steam fogged the windows while the smell drifted through the house, wrapping around everyone like a promise of comfort. It was gamey, rich, and deeply satisfying, an old-world supper that turned survival into celebration. Every bite reminded folks that food earned by hand carried a different kind of pride. Families would sit quiet except for the clink of spoons and soft hums of contentment. Rabbit and dumplings filled bellies and hearts alike, warming even the coldest nights. It was country comfort at its finest, built from grit, gratitude, and a little wild luck. In mountain homes, it stood as proof that patience and hard work always paid off. The meal may have been humble, but the feeling it brought was priceless. Home, warmth, and a kind of joy you could only taste. Number 17. Ramps and scrambled eggs. Ramps are the wild leeks that come up in the holler hardwood every March, and they have a smell that lingers on a kitchen for 2 days. A half-dozen ramps chopped fine, sweated in bacon grease for 2 minutes, then 2 beaten eggs scrambled in slow until they just set. A piece of buttered toast underneath. The supper takes 4 minutes, and the ramps are free for anyone who knows where to find them. Hill families in Madison County and across the Smokies built the spring around this meal, and the annual ramp festivals in Cosby and White Top still draw families that have gathered the same patches for 4 generations. For one plate, a half handful of ramps is plenty, and the smell tells the neighbors what was for supper without anyone having to say. Number 15. Putting up home-rendered lard to sell. After hog killing day, the kitchen filled with the smell of fat slowly melting down in a great kettle, and the snow-white lard that came off it was gold. Cooks ladled it into crocks, used it for everything from pie crust to frying, and sold the surplus to anybody who came calling. Good lard was a reputation in itself, but lard rendered from a home-slaughtered, uninspected hog falls under the same Federal Meat Inspection Act that governs the meat itself. Once you sell or trade an animal product that never passed through an inspected facility, you have stepped over a federal line, and even kitchens that qualify for the custom exemption are still bound by the law's rules against adulteration and misbranding. The cottage food laws that let a baker sell cookies do not extend to a rendered animal fat, so the prized crock of pure white lard, once a small income in itself, can no longer change hands the way it did. Fried squirrel with milk gravy turned small game into Christmas celebration, tasting like hickory nuts and mountain tradition. December, squirrels were fat from fall acorns, their meat firm and flavorful. Young boys went hunting Christmas Eve morning, fathers teaching them to shoot cleanly. The squirrels were cleaned, cut into pieces, then soaked overnight in salt water. On Christmas morning, they were dredged in seasoned flour and fried in hot lard until golden crispy. Pan drippings became milk gravy, flour stirred into hot fat, then milk added slowly until thickened creamy. Families served this over fresh-baked biscuits. In Appalachian communities, Squirrel Christmas meant teaching children to hunt, to provide. Understanding food came from work. The meat was tender and slightly nutty, each piece representing hours in cold December woods. Mothers fried batch after batch, keeping platters warm. This wasn't poverty food, but tradition connecting tables to land itself. Number 21. The soup bean sandwich. Pinto beans cooked low and slow with a piece of salt pork until they fell apart. You mashed a spoonful of those beans onto a piece of cornbread or white bread, added raw onion if you had it, and ate it with your hands. This was a Monday sandwich in eastern Kentucky and southwest Virginia, where a pot of beans simmered on the stove all weekend and showed up in every form imaginable by midweek. The beans had enough starch to hold together on the bread, and the salt pork gave the whole thing a richness that disguised how cheap it really was. A 10-pound bag of pinto beans fed a family for weeks. The soup bean sandwich was proof that poverty made people creative long before anyone called it resourceful. There was a time when a sandwich was not a product. It was an answer to a question nobody asked out loud, which was, how do you feed people when the money runs out before the month does? The Hillbilly sandwich did not come from a cookbook or a television show. It came from the back of the pantry, from the garden, from the smokehouse, from the woods behind the house. Every one of them solved the same problem. Turn almost nothing into something a person could hold in two hands and eat standing up, sitting on a porch step, or walking to the barn. The grocery chains replaced that knowledge with convenience, and convenience replaced memory. A generation of sandwiches disappeared not because they failed, but because they were too cheap to sell. Number 12. Boiling chicken feet for the gelatin in the broth. She said the feet were the secret to the soup. Your grandmother bought a pound of yellow chicken feet at the meat counter in 1965 for 11 cents, blanched them 30 seconds in boiling water, peeled the tough outer skin off under cold running water, and slid the cleaned feet into a stock pot of cold water with an onion, a carrot top, and black pepper. 6 hours at a low simmer at the rear of the cook stove. The broth turned a deep color of dark tea, thick enough to coat a spoon and hold the spoon in the bowl when you set it down. She used the broth as the base for chicken and dumplings, the simmer water for the rice, the stock for the soup beans, and the wash for the cornbread skillet on Sunday morning. 1 pound of feet stretched into 6 full pots of cooking through the week. Today, a pound of chicken feet still costs you under $2, and a quart of bone broth at the grocery runs nearly $9. The gelatin was the secret. The patience was the recipe. Number 10. Divinity with black walnuts. Here is a candy that belongs to Christmas. 2 cups of sugar, a half cup of corn syrup, a half cup of water, cooked to hardball stage, then beaten into 2 stiff egg whites until it turned white as a church dress. At the last moment, a cup of chopped black walnuts gathered from the yard in October was folded in. The grandmother dropped it onto waxed paper by the teaspoon. 24 small, snowy mounds. It sat on a saucer on the sideboard from Christmas Eve until New Year's. A divinity that failed because the weather was damp or the beating was off was a minor family tragedy. Hillbilly grandmothers from Pickett County, Tennessee to Braxton County, West Virginia, swore you could not make a good divinity on a rainy day. They were not superstitious, but they were right. The sugar refused to set. Before store-bought milk reached the deep hollows, Cherokee families had already learned to pull richness from the forest floor. Hickory nuts fell in October, and their shells were brutal. Cracked with a hammer or the flat of an iron, the nut meats came out in tiny, stubborn fragments. But the real secret was not the meat, it was the shells. You crushed everything, meat, shell, all of it, dropped the pieces into boiling water, and simmered until a thin, milky liquid rose to the surface. Strained through cloth, it became hickory nut milk, rich enough to stir into cornbread batter or pour over hominy. The flavor was deeper than cow's milk, nuttier than cream. Mountain settlers adopted the method, and children earned pennies selling shelled nuts at the general store. But the ones who boiled the whole thing knew the real flavor lived in what everyone else threw away. Number 24, creamed chipped beef on toast. Thin slices of dried, salted beef pulled from a small armor glass jar, stirred into a roux of butter, flour, and whole milk, then poured over toasted Wonder Bread. The Army called it SOS. The Navy made it with tomato. Civilian families inherited it from fathers who had eaten it on ships and at Fort Bragg. It became a Sunday night supper because it cost almost nothing and could be on the table in 12 minutes. Picture a husband home from second shift, eating it standing at the counter while the kids did homework. By the late 1960s, the armor jar was migrating to the back of the grocery shelf. The veterans who learned to love it began passing, and their grandchildren had no taste for the salt or the memory. The dish refused to disappear in military families where you could still find it on a Sunday plate as late as 1978, and the recipe still works the way it used to, but the audience for it does not. Nobody bought a cast iron skillet. You inherited one. It came to you black and smooth from decades of lard and heat, seasoned by every meal your mother and her mother cooked before you, and the first rule was that you never, not once, let soap touch that surface. You wiped it clean with salt and a rag while it was still warm. You dried it over the flame. You rubbed it with a thin coat of grease before you put it away. The skillet remembered every pork chop, every batch of cornbread, every egg fried in bacon fat at 5 in the morning before the men left for the mine. Those skillets outlived the women who used them. Now companies sell new cast iron for $200 and call it heritage cookware. They write instructions on how to season it, as if the knowledge could come from a pamphlet instead of standing next to someone who never needed one. Number 16, tamale pie. This was not a tamale, and it was not really a pie. But nobody cared what you called it, because it disappeared from the dish before you could argue about the name. You browned ground beef with onion and chili powder, stirred in canned tomatoes and a handful of sliced black olives, and poured it into a casserole dish. Then you spread a thick layer of cornmeal batter over the top and baked it until the crust turned golden and pulled away from the edges. The cornmeal top cracked when you cut into it, and underneath was a thick, spicy, meaty filling that tasted like a tamale without any of the work. Church cookbooks across the Southwest printed this recipe so often the pages were stained with grease. One dish, one oven, no rolling corn husks, no steaming for hours. It was the shortcut that actually worked. You used the wrong tub once, just once. That was how you learned. The 3-tub system that governed Hillbilly Wash Day was not complicated, but it was absolute. The first tub held hot soapy water for washing. The second held clean, warm water for rinsing the soap out. And the third, kept separate, always to the right, filled last, held the bluing water. Getting the order wrong meant hauling fresh water all over again. wasting a morning's fire and hearing about it until supper. The wash moved through those tubs in one direction only, dirty to clean to white. The soap tub went gray within an hour. The rinse tub went milky. The bluing tub stayed that thin sky blue all morning, the color so faint you almost thought you'd imagined it. Women who grew up with this system couldn't understand, later, how a single machine with one drum was supposed to do what 3 separate tubs accomplished in careful sequence. The logic wasn't nostalgia. It was chemistry. Number 7. Red beans and rice. Soak a bag of dried red kidney beans overnight, then simmer them low and slow with an onion, a few cloves of garlic, a bay leaf, and whatever scrap of pork happened to be in the house. A ham bone, a few slices of salt pork, the end of a smoked sausage that nobody claimed. By the time the beans turned soft and the liquid cooked down into a thick, creamy gravy, the rice was done and the whole kitchen smelled like a Monday in New Orleans. That is because Monday was wash day, and red beans went on the stove in the morning because they did not need tending while a woman spent the day over a scrub board. The pot handled itself. The beans broke down and thickened on their own. The pork gave up its salt and smoke, and by evening the only work left was scooping a mound of white rice onto a plate and ladling the beans over the top. Families ate this every single week without getting tired of it, because the flavor shifted depending on what pork was available and how long the pot had been going. A grandmother who set this on the table was not making a sacrifice. She was using the oldest trick in her kitchen, a pot that cooked itself while she handled everything else the day demanded. Cornmeal mush was exactly what it sounded like. Cornmeal stirred slowly into boiling water until it thickened into a dense, porridge-like mass. But the real meal came the next morning, when the leftover mush had been poured into a loaf pan and left to set firm in the cold. You sliced it thick, laid the slices in a skillet with hot grease, and fried them until both sides turned golden and crisp, while the center stayed soft and creamy. Cherokee communities had been cooking cornmeal this way long before German-American settlers in the Appalachian foothills adopted the technique, a practice that showed up in household records from Western Virginia and the Carolinas as far back as the 1700s. Topped with sorghum syrup or a drizzle of honey, fried mush was breakfast and supper depending on the household, and the overnight wait was the whole secret. Fresh mush fell apart in the skillet. You had to let the cold do the work. Patience was the ingredient that never made it into the recipe. The soup bone and potato hash was what happened when thrift met hunger. After a long week, that old soup bone still had work to do. It went back into the pot for one more boil, drawing out every ounce of flavor left in it. Then you would toss in diced potatoes, onions, maybe a carrot if you were lucky, and fry it all together until crisp. The smell filled the kitchen with promise, even when there was not much else to eat. Mountain cooking was about stretching what you had until it could not stretch anymore. This hash tasted smoky, salty, and satisfying. Nothing fancy, just real food made by real hands. Families knew that wasting even a scrap was a sin against hard work. Soup bone and potato hash proved that resourcefulness could taste every bit as good as abundance when cooked with patience and pride. Number 24, hot water cornbread, cornmeal, and a pinch of salt in a tin bowl, boiling water poured over, stirred until it just holds together as a thick paste. Patted into 3 small cakes and fried in hot bacon grease until the edges are lace. Kratos Williams, the Appalachian scholar from Watauga County, wrote that hot water cornbread was the first supper a child learned to make, and the last one an old widow stopped making. There is no egg, no buttermilk, no leavening, and the recipe survived 2 centuries of mountain winters because it works with whatever is left in the cornmeal sack. 3 cakes feed 1 person well, with 2 left over for breakfast, cold and crumbled into coffee. The dish has lived in the mountains since before the railroads came, and it has not changed its shape since. Number 20, putting up pickles and kraut in a galvanized wash tub. Come harvest, the big zinc-coated tub came down off the porch nail and got pressed into double duty, soaking cucumbers in brine or holding shredded cabbage under a weighted plate until it soured. It was the biggest vessel in the house, so it made sense. The problem is chemistry. Acidic food and zinc do not mix. The brine and the vinegar eat right through the galvanized coating and pull zinc salts into the food, enough to make a family sick. Zinc poisoning brings on cramps and nausea within hours, which is just why inspectors singled the old tubs out. The Federal Food Code, going back to its 1997 edition, states plainly that galvanized metal may not be used for any food contact surface that touches acidic food. That covers exactly what those tubs were used for. So, the all-purpose wash tub that doubled as a pickling crock is now off limits for the job. Wild turkey roasted with chestnut dressing was Christmas dinner that required hunting success and forest knowledge. These weren't farm turkeys, but wild birds shot in December woods, their meat darker and more flavorful than domestic fowl. The turkey was stuffed with dressing made from dried cornbread, wild chestnuts gathered in fall, sage, and onions. Roasted slowly, the bird developed crispy skin while staying moist inside, the chestnut dressing absorbing juices and becoming rich and savory. In mountain communities, wild turkey represented Christmas success. The hunter who brought one home provided real celebration. The meat was lean and slightly gamey, requiring careful cooking to stay tender. Chestnuts added sweetness and texture impossible with modern ingredients. This was Christmas earned through December mornings in cold woods, through knowing turkey habits and shooting straight. The finished bird-fed extended family, its presence on the table marking genuine achievement. Number 23. The fried green tomato sandwich. You sliced a green tomato thick, at least a quarter inch, dredged it in cornmeal with salt and pepper, and fried it in a cast iron skillet until the coating crackled. Then you laid it on white bread, sometimes with a smear of mayonnaise, sometimes plain. The tomato stayed tart and firm inside that cornmeal shell, nothing like a ripe tomato. This was a late summer sandwich in the Appalachian foothills, when the garden was producing faster than anyone could eat and the first frost was still weeks away. You used the green ones because the ripe ones were going into canning jars. Nothing went to waste. The fried green tomato sandwich was what happened when practicality and flavor landed on the same plate. Number 8. Baking vinegar pie when the fruit jars were already empty. By February, your cellar was thin and the fruit jars were down to 2, and that was the month your grandmother baked vinegar pie. She mixed 3 tablespoons of Heinz cider vinegar with 1 full cup of Domino sugar, 2 beaten eggs, a quarter cup of melted butter, and a half cup of water in a saucepan. She cooked it slow until the mix turned into a tart yellow custard, the color of late evening sun on a porch board. She poured the mix into a single crust rolled from flour and lard and baked it at 350 for about 35 minutes. The filling set up so it tasted exactly like a lemon meringue, which is what she told the children, and the children never asked again. There was no fruit in the pie. There was no fruit in the cellar. The whole pie cost under 20 cents in 1965. Today, your ingredients still run under $2. The pie that fooled 4 children in February was the cheapest dessert any Appalachian kitchen ever served. Number 14. Hickory nut cake. The hickory tree is a stingy tree. The nuts are small, the shell is thick, the meat inside is the size of a baby's fingernail. To fill a single cup, you sit on a porch in November with a hammer and a flat rock and you work for an hour. A grandmother in Watauga County, North Carolina, put her grandchildren to the job every fall. Each child got a penny a cup. It took a whole Saturday to earn a nickel. The cake was worth it. 2 layers, butter, sugar, milk, eggs, flour, and 2 cups of hickory meat stirred through the batter at the very end. A boiled white icing over the top. The flavor is delicate, slightly smoky, nothing like a pecan. There are fewer than a dozen places in America where you can still buy a slice of real hickory nut cake. Most of them are within 80 miles of the ridge where Ella May was born. Before ice boxes, before anyone in the hollow had heard the word Frigidaire, the spring house kept milk sweet and butter firm through the worst heat and the longest cold. A small stone or log shed built over a natural spring, it channeled cold water through shallow wooden troughs where crocks of buttermilk sat half submerged. Butter molds rested on wet stone shelves. In winter, the constant temperature of the spring, around 50 degrees year-round, kept everything from freezing when the outside air dropped below zero. Churning happened faster in there because the cool air helped fat solidify. You knew a family's spring house by its smell: clean water, cold stone, and the faint tang of fresh dairy. The women who tended these buildings understood humidity and airflow without ever naming those concepts. They knew when the water ran too fast or too slow by touching a crock. Most spring houses are gone now, collapsed behind an empty farmhouse, the spring still running underneath. Number 14. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze. 2 pounds of ground chuck mixed with a sleeve of crushed saltines, a small grated onion, 2 eggs, a splash of whole milk, and a heel of stale bread soaked soft. Pressed into a Pyrex loaf pan, slathered with a half cup of Heinz ketchup and a tablespoon of brown sugar, baked an hour at 350. The whole thing cost $1 and fed 5 people with leftovers for sandwiches the next day. Every American kitchen had a version of it. The recipe was on the back of the saltine box, on the side of the ketchup bottle, in the family Bible. Nobody measured. Through the 1960s, meatloaf was Tuesday dinner and reheated lunch and the cold sandwich a husband took to the plant in a tin pail. It survived because it was forgiving. A cup more breadcrumbs, a little less meat, an onion if you had one. The dish carried families through every paycheck week and every layoff. Then, in the 1990s, ground beef got more expensive than chicken breast, and the saltines started costing more than the ground beef. Meatloaf moved to once a month, then to never. Today, it is a chalkboard special at a diner that calls itself retro, served with mashed potatoes you did not make. You can still pull a Pyrex loaf pan out of any thrift store in the country for $2. The pan outlived the dinner. Long before anyone called it gut health, the crocks were already working. Sauerkraut packed in salt and pressed under a stone, cucumber pickles brined in vinegar and dill with a grape leaf dropped in to keep them crisp. Chow chow relish made from the last green tomatoes before the first frost, chopped with cabbage and onion and peppers, and sealed in jars that glowed yellow and green on the cellar shelf. Fermentation was not a food trend. It was the only way to make vegetables last from October to April when you had no freezer, and the nearest grocery was 20 miles of bad road. The German and Scots-Irish settlers who came into the Appalachian valleys brought these techniques with them in the 1700s, and they passed them down so consistently that families in West Virginia were still using the same crocks and the same brine ratios 2 centuries later. Kombucha alone is now a $3 billion industry. The crocks that started it all are in antique shops. Number 10. Shepherd's pie. Ground beef browned with onion and mixed with canned peas, carrots, and a pour of leftover gravy. You spread it into a baking dish and covered the whole surface with mashed potatoes, then dragged a fork across the top so the peaks would brown in the oven. 30 minutes later, the potato crust had gone golden at the tips, and the meat filling was bubbling up through the cracks at the edges. You served it with a big spoon straight from the dish. 1 scoop held everything a meal needed. Meat on the bottom, vegetables in the middle, starch on top. Mothers who made Sunday roast on the weekend turned Monday's leftovers into this without a recipe or a second thought. The dish stretched 1 pound of hamburger into a full family dinner that looked like it took an hour but needed 20 minutes of actual work. There is a moment after the children leave and the house goes quiet when you have to decide whether you are still going to set the table, whether you are going to cook a real dinner or just open a can of soup and eat it standing at the counter. That decision sounds small. It is not. It is about whether you still believe you are worth the effort of a hot meal on a real plate. The women who made the dinners on this list did not cook because it was fun or because anyone thanked them for it. They cooked because dinner was the 1 hour of the day when the family sat in the same room and ate the same food and talked about the same things. When the family left, the question changed. It was no longer what are we having tonight, it was whether to bother at all. The answer, for the ones who kept cooking, was always yes. Nothing in that household was wasted, least of all the ash and the fat. After hog-killing day in late November, your grandmother saved every scrap of fat not destined for the lard bucket, rendering it down in the yard kettle until it ran pale and clear. All winter she had been filling the leaching barrel, a wooden drum packed with hardwood ash, water seeping down through the layers and dripping out as lye. She tested it the old way. A chicken feather dissolved in the liquid meant the strength was right. She combined the lye with the rendered fat, stirred with a long wooden spoon, and cooked it down until the mixture saponified. Turned to soap right there in the pot. It hardened in wooden molds into brown, rough-textured bars that lasted 6 months. The soap cost nothing but the time and the materials the farm had already produced. It stripped grease from overalls and oil from work shirts and left the skin raw as a verdict. Nobody made it because they liked it. They made it because what it made was real and it worked, and nothing that could be bought worked half as well. Number 9. Leftover hash. Whatever sat in the refrigerator from the last 2 nights got chopped together and fried in a cast iron skillet. Sunday's roast, Monday's potatoes, half an onion, a few soft carrots, all of it diced and pressed flat into the hot pan until the bottom formed a dark, crackling crust. A fried egg went on top if there was one to spare, and the yolk ran into everything and turned the whole plate into something better than any of the original meals those leftovers came from. Nothing was measured. Nothing was followed from a card. The skillet decided the portion, and the refrigerator decided the ingredients. And between the two of them, supper appeared in about 12 minutes without anyone having to think. The crispy bottom was what everyone reached for first, and the last scraped bits from the pan were always the best bites of the night. There was a time when the last meal of the day cost nothing but a fistful of cold cornbread and whatever buttermilk was left in the jar. Cornbread crumbled into buttermilk, eaten from a glass with a long spoon, was supper for families across Appalachia, the Ozarks, and the rural Deep South from the Depression years straight through the 1970s. The cornbread had to be cold, at least a few hours old, firm enough to hold its shape when the buttermilk hit it. You crumbled it by hand, poured the buttermilk over, and ate it standing at the counter or sitting on the porch in the dark. A full glass cost less than 3 cents in the 1940s. It required no stove, no heat, no preparation beyond the breaking of bread. The people who ate this every night did not call it a recipe. They called it Tuesday. Ramps and eggs were spring's homecoming song in the hills. Ramps, those wild mountain onions with a kick sharp enough to make your eyes water, came up when winter loosened its grip. Folks foraged them along shady slopes, carrying bunches home like treasure. Fried in bacon grease, they turned golden and fragrant, and when you cracked eggs over them, the skillet became a celebration of survival. After months of salted meats and dried beans, this meal tasted alive again. The air filled with that pungent scent only mountain people could love. It was quick to make, rich in flavor, and a sure sign that better weather had arrived. Ramps and eggs reminded everyone that the land still provided if you knew where to look. That first bite after the thaw was like breathing again, spicy, hearty, and filled with gratitude for another season of life in the Appalachian Hills. Number 29. Cornbread crumbled in a glass of buttermilk. A wedge of yesterday's skillet cornbread broken into a tall glass, cold buttermilk poured over the top, and a spoon. That is the whole meal. In the hill country of East Tennessee, a working farm widow named it her summer supper because the stove never had to come back on. The sour bite of the buttermilk and the sweet crumb of the bread made a balance that has no equivalent in any modern grocery store. The dish kept Appalachian families fed through August heat for 2 centuries. Ronnie Lundy gave it its own page in her cookbook on the foods of the Southern Mountains. It is dignified, fast, and costs less than a quarter when buttermilk is on sale. Number 19. Digging wild ginseng to flavor a tonic. Sang hunting was a hill country tradition older than the states themselves, and the gnarled root went into bitter teas, restoratives, and the occasional pot of medicine soup. A good patch was a family secret passed down in whispers. The wild plant is now one of the most tightly guarded in the woods. In 1975, American ginseng was placed on Appendix 2 of an international treaty that protects species from being dug into extinction, and the harvest is now boxed in by hard rules. Most states allow digging only during a narrow fall season, only from mature plants at least 5 years old, and selling out of state requires a dealer permit. The Forest Service has flat-out suspended ginseng harvesting across thousands of square miles of Appalachian National Forest. So that quiet walk into the hills to dig a root for the pot now runs straight into a wall of regulation. Blackberry jam cake was Christmas dessert carrying summer's wild harvest into winter celebration. This wasn't ordinary cake, but dense creation, darkened with blackberry jam stirred into batter. The jam came from wild berries picked along fence rows in July, cooked with sugar and preserved. Come Christmas, jam transformed into cake moisture and flavor, tart, sweet, purple. The batter was spiced with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, creating warmth, complementing berry brightness. Baked in cast iron, the cake emerged dark and fragrant, its crumb tight from jam. Some families added caramel icing, others served plain. In mountain communities, blackberry jam cake represented foresight and connection to land, picking berries in summer for Christmas months away. Children remembered helping pick berries, fingers stained purple. Understanding this work would become December dessert. The cake sliced thick, each piece carrying memories of summer foraging. Number 12. The cold biscuit and country ham. Country ham was salt-cured and smoked, and a whole ham hung in the smokehouse for months before anyone touched it. You sliced it thin, and if you were eating it hot, you fried it in a skillet and made red-eye gravy from the drippings. But the cold version was its own thing entirely. You took a leftover biscuit from breakfast, split it open, and laid a thin slice of uncooked country ham right on the bread. The salt in the ham was intense, almost sharp, and the cold biscuit was dense and firm from sitting on the counter since morning. Field workers in Virginia and Kentucky carried these in their coat pockets wrapped in a piece of cloth. The salt preserved the ham without refrigeration, and the biscuit held together no matter how rough the day got. It was portable, durable, and filling, and it tasted like smoke and salt and the place you came from. Number 10. Sewing flour sacks into dish towels, dresses, and curtains. She said the sack was as much cloth as it was flour. The flour sack was the hidden grocery in every Appalachian kitchen of the 1960s. A 25-pound sack of Martha White self-rising flour cost $1.15 and came printed in soft cotton patterns the mills knew the women would save. Your grandmother washed the sack 3 times to soften the flour scent, ironed it flat under a damp cloth, and cut it into dish towels, an apron, a child's school dress, and the curtain over your kitchen window. She bought a single sack of flour and walked away with the flour, the dress for her daughter, the curtain for the window, and the towel for the dishes. The mill printed roses, ginghams, and small calicos because the woman who chose the sack chose the cloth as much as the flour. Today, a yard of cotton at the fabric store costs around $12, and a sack of flour comes in plastic. The same $1.15 used to walk out of the store as a week of your meals and a winter's worth of curtains. Number 18. Chess pie. Chess pie is what you make when you have almost nothing. A stick of butter, a cup of sugar, 2 eggs, a tablespoon of cornmeal, a teaspoon of vinegar, a splash of vanilla if you had vanilla, a pie crust because you could always manage a pie crust out of flour and lard. That is the whole architecture. It bakes into a gold, cracked top over a layer of something between pudding and candy. It is rich in the way a poor family's dessert is rich, which is to say, with the last of what was on the shelf, used well. The Appalachian grandmothers who served chess pie at funeral dinners knew a quiet thing. A simple pie made from pantry scrapings says to a grieving family what a fancy cake cannot. It says, "I had you in mind. I stood in my kitchen and I thought of you." Soured corn sounds like a mistake. It was one of the sharpest preservation tricks in the Appalachian kitchen. Fermented field corn that became a thick, tangy porridge when almost nothing else remained on the shelf. You shucked dried corn, packed the kernels tight in a stoneware crock, covered them with salted water, weighted the top with a plate and a clean rock, and left it in a cool corner for weeks. Natural bacteria broke down the starch and produced a sour, slightly fizzy mash you could fry in lard, boil into gruel, or stir into soup. German settlers brought the fermentation instinct from the old country, the same impulse behind sauerkraut, and adapted it to the one crop they had in abundance. The taste was strong. In February, when the canned tomatoes were gone and the cellar was thinning, soured corn was still there, bubbling quietly in its crock, asking nothing and giving enough. Number 18, stuffed cabbage rolls. Boiled cabbage leaves wrapped around a filling of ground beef, ground pork, onion, and white rice, packed shoulder to shoulder in a deep pot, simmered for 2 hours in tomato sauce. Polish neighborhoods in Hamtramck and Buffalo called them golubki. Slovak families in Pittsburgh called them halupki. By the 1960s, the second generation had anglicized them to stuffed cabbage and served them on church basement tables every Friday during Lent. The dish was an immigrant inheritance that survived Ellis Island and 2 world wars. What it could not survive was the third generation moving to the suburbs and learning to call them weird. A retired mill worker in Cleveland still made 100 at a time and froze them in Maxwell House coffee cans. He died in 1991, and the recipe died with him. The grandchildren remembered the smell. They could not remember the proportions. The cabbage went back to coleslaw, the ground meat went into hamburgers, and the rice ended up in a side dish nobody named. And the dish became a memory of a smell instead of a recipe. Number 18 went from a Sunday tradition to a museum entry inside one generation. That was how fast a dinner could vanish. Nobody told you where the morels grew. That was the rule. A family's mushroom spots were guarded the way a family's still site was guarded. You found out through blood or marriage, and even then, you kept your mouth shut about it. They came up in April and May after the first warm rains, in the kind of soil that forms around dying elms and tulip poplars, and the people who hunted them could walk through a stand of timber and see what everyone else missed. The honeycomb caps poking through dead leaves, pale and wrinkled, barely taller than a thumb. You carried them home in a mesh bag so the spores would drop through and seed the next year's crop, a detail no beginner's guide thought to mention. Hill families fried them in butter with salt and ate them the same night because they did not keep. Morels bridged the gap between winter stores and spring planting, the first wild food of the season when the cellar was almost bare. They sell for $50 a pound now at specialty grocers, and foraging workshops charge admission to teach people to find what mountain kids spotted before they could read. Number 19. Wiener and bean bake. You sliced a package of hot dogs into coins, stirred them into 2 cans of pork and beans, added a spoonful of yellow mustard and a squeeze of ketchup, and poured the whole thing into a baking dish. Some families laid extra hot dog halves across the top like little logs. Others mixed in diced onion or a handful of brown sugar. Then you baked it until the edges bubbled and the sauce turned thick and dark. This was not a recipe anyone wrote down. It was not in any cookbook. It was the meal that happened when a mother opened the refrigerator, found a package of Franks and not much else, and reached for the canned beans on the shelf because she knew the combination worked. Every family had a version. The variations were small and fiercely defended. Some used barbecue sauce instead of ketchup. Others stirred in a can of drained pineapple chunks, which sounds wrong but tasted like summer. A few families in the Midwest topped the dish with cornbread batter and baked it until the bread rose up golden over the beans. Children loved it because it tasted like a backyard cookout served indoors. Parents loved it because the whole dish cost less than the gas it took to drive to the store. 1 package of hot dogs and 2 cans of beans fed a table of 6, and the baking dish came out of the oven looking like something you had planned all along. Nobody told you the rules of the clothesline. You absorbed them by watching long enough until the knowledge became your own. Whites went on the outside lines where the sun hid all morning. The unmentionables went in the middle, hidden behind the sheets where the road couldn't see them. You never hung a shirt by the shoulders, always by the tail or the shoulders stretched crooked. Never left clothespins on the line overnight. And never, under any roof in any county, hung wash on a Sunday. She kept those rules not because anyone was checking, but because the standard was the standard. The day they took her to the hospital, there was a full line of whites out. Her daughter brought them in dry, folded them without shaking, and put them in the drawer. They stayed there for years. Number 18. Onion sandwich. Slice a raw white onion thick. Lay the rings between 2 slices of soft white bread spread with mayonnaise. Press the sandwich flat and eat it before you had time to reconsider. In the Midwest and parts of the South, this was a real meal on a real table, not a joke and not a dare. The bite of the raw onion cut through the fat of the mayonnaise, and the bread held it all together just long enough to finish. Grandmothers who served this knew what they were doing. The onion was sharp enough to wake up a palate that had lost interest in everything else in the kitchen, and the whole sandwich took less than a minute to assemble. On the hottest nights of summer, when the stove radiated heat into a house that already felt like a closed car, nobody was going to argue with a sandwich that required no cooking, no waiting, and no dishes beyond a butter knife and a cutting board. The sound came first, a sharp hiss when hot bacon grease hit raw greens, and then the smell of vinegar rising in a cloud of steam that filled the kitchen before the plate reached the table. Kilt lettuce, sometimes called killed lettuce, was the Appalachian way of turning raw leaf lettuce into something warm and wilted and dressed all at once. You picked the lettuce fresh from the garden, leaf lettuce, never iceberg, piled it in a bowl, and poured a hot dressing of bacon grease, apple cider vinegar, and a pinch of sugar directly over the raw leaves. The heat wilted them instantly, and you ate it before it cooled, because kilt lettuce that sat too long turned limp and sad. The window between too small and too bitter lasted only a few weeks. You didn't need a calendar. The lettuce told you when it was ready. Cabbage and ham hock soup was the kind of dinner that filled both bellies and souls when times were thin and money ran out. The hock, tough and bony but rich with hidden flavor, simmered for hours until the meat fell away and the broth turned smoky. Chopped cabbage leaves, onions, and potatoes joined the pot, soaking up the taste that only slow cooking and patience could bring. The kitchen filled with steam and scent, proof that comfort was brewing even without much to spare. It was not fancy, but it fed families for days and cost next to nothing. In mountain kitchens, the secret was never waste. It was making do and making magic from scraps. The sound of the spoon scraping the pot was the sound of gratitude itself. Every bowl carried the story of thrift and resilience. A steaming ladle served on a cold evening felt like victory over hardship. Even with little meat, the broth was rich, the cabbage sweet, and the memory lasting. Ham hock soup reminded everyone that love and labor make the best seasoning of all. It was humble food, but it held more comfort than gold ever could. Number 26. Sawmill gravy on one split biscuit. A spoon of bacon grease in a small skillet. A spoon of flour stirred in until it smells like toast. Then a half cup of cold milk whisked slow over low heat. Salt, plenty of black pepper, and nothing else. The gravy thickens in about 4 minutes and turns the color of unbleached linen. A biscuit split open underneath, the gravy ladled over, and supper is on the plate. Mill workers in Sevier County, Tennessee, ate this with whatever the day had left over, and the gravy got its name from the sawdust-looking flour gravy that flowed at the lumber camps. For one person at home, the recipe halves cleanly. The biscuit can be from a tube on a tired evening. No one in the holler ever held that against anyone. Number 24. Sassafras root tea. On a slow Sunday afternoon, a hill country cook would dig the red roots, scrub off the dirt, and boil them down into a rosy tea that tasted faintly of root beer and smelled like spring itself. It was the family tonic, served hot in winter to thin the blood and cold in summer to settle the stomach. The whole holler ran on it. Then in December of 1960, the Food and Drug Administration ruled that saffrole, the oil that gives sassafras root that warm flavor, caused liver tumors in lab animals. They declared any food containing it adulterated and pulled it from the market entirely. The root bark is roughly 80% saffrole by oil, so the genuine article was finished overnight. That is why store root beer lost its old bite and why a real cup brewed from the wild root crosses a line the government drew 60-some years ago. The Sunday tonic is now contraband. Stack cake with dried apple filling was Christmas dessert requiring community cooperation and weeks of preparation. This wasn't ordinary cake, but thin layers stacked with dried apple filling, creating towering centerpiece feeding dozens. Women began drying apples in late summer, slicing thin and laying on screens until leathery. Come Christmas, apples were rehydrated and cooked with molasses and cinnamon until thick. The cake layers were simple: flour, lard, molasses, spices, rolled thin and baked separately. Assembly was ceremony, each layer placed and spread with apple mixture. The cake sat for days, letting flavors meld into something slicing clean and tasting like autumn. In mountain communities, stack cake represented cooperation because neighbors often brought layers to celebrations. The finished cake stood tall, dark layers visible through golden apple filling. This represented mountain Christmas, patient, cooperative, deeply satisfying. Number 18, the sardine and cracker sandwich. A tin of sardines cost a dime at the general store, and it kept on the shelf for years without refrigeration. You peeled back the tin lid, laid the sardines on saltine crackers, added a drop of hot sauce if you had a bottle around, and that was lunch. Coal miners in West Virginia and Kentucky carried sardine tins in their lunch pails because the fish did not spoil in the heat of the mine. Farmers kept a few tins in the barn for the same reason. The oil in the tin was salty and rich, and some people poured it right over the crackers. It was protein that traveled well and asked nothing of you in return. No cooking, no preparation, no cleanup. Just peel, eat, and throw the tin in the trash. Number 20, frying yesterday's mashed potatoes into supper patties. Frying the leftover mashed potatoes was the simplest second-act supper a hillbilly kitchen ever served. The cold potatoes got scraped out of the icebox bowl, mixed with 1 beaten egg, 2 spoonfuls of flour, salt and black pepper, and a fistful of chopped green onion. The patties were shaped on a wooden board, dredged each side in cornmeal, and laid into a hot greased skillet for 3 minutes per side. The outside went golden brown, and the inside held tender. 3 patties with a slice of cold ham and a spoon of chow chow fed a child to bed full. Number 17, buttermilk pie. Buttermilk was not wasted in a hillbilly kitchen. Not ever. What was left after the butter came out of the churn went into biscuits, into pancakes, into the dog's bowl on a hot afternoon, and once or twice a month, into a pie. A cup and a half of buttermilk, a cup and a half of sugar, 3 eggs, a stick of butter, flour, lemon if a neighbor down the road had brought one up from Tennessee. The custard set creamy and tangy with a thin, crackled sugar skin on top. A farm wife in Owsley County named it a desperation pie because she made it in the weeks before the first peach came ripe. Her children called it the best pie she made, but she never believed them. Every October, before the first real cold snap settled into the hollows, someone had to bank the cabin. Banking meant shoveling dirt, mixed with clay if you could get it, up against the bottom logs, packing it halfway up the lowest course. That gap between the ground and the foundation log never sat flush, and wind cut through it all night long. Some households piled earth so many years running that the cabin looked half buried, like it was sinking into the mountain. Inside, the women recharged the chinking between every log, pushing fresh mud into cracks that had dried and crumbled since spring. You could hear the difference on a windy night. A well-banked cabin held warmth like a fist around the stove. A neglected one whistled. Old-timers said you could tell how a family was doing just by looking at the base of their house in November. Number 15, beef stroganoff over noodles. A pound of sirloin tips browned hard in a skillet, finished with sliced mushrooms and a pan sauce of beef broth, mustard, and a half pint of sour cream stirred in off the heat. Spooned over wide egg noodles. The dish came home with American GIs from Europe and entered the home cooking magazines by 1955. Through the 1960s, every Betty Crocker cookbook had a version. It was Saturday night dinner before company arrived. Fancy enough to feel like a treat, fast enough to make in 40 minutes. The sour cream curdled if the heat got too high. Mothers warned daughters about that one over the phone. By the time Hamburger Helper arrived in 1971 with a powdered version, the from-scratch dish was already retreating to special occasions. Today, it has retreated all the way out of the rotation. During the Depression, you could not find a dandelion in northern Illinois. They were eaten as fast as they appeared. That was not a gardening choice. It was survival. The bright green leaves that most people now spray with weed killer were the only fresh vegetables some families had access to in early spring, and they were packed with more iron, calcium, and vitamins than anything sitting on a grocery store shelf. Your grandmother knew to pick them young, before the flowers opened, when the leaves were still tender enough to eat raw with a little vinegar and bacon fat drizzled on top. She boiled the older ones 3 times to pull out the bitterness, the same technique she used on poke greens and mustard. Now, urban foraging classes charge $60 a session to teach people how to identify what every poor family already knew was growing in their own front yard. The greens have not changed. The people picking them have. Number 17. Stuffed green peppers. You cut the tops off, scooped out the seeds, and filled each pepper with a mixture of ground beef, cooked rice, diced onion, and canned tomato sauce. Then you stood them upright in a baking dish, poured more tomato sauce around the base, and baked them for about 45 minutes until the peppers softened and the filling firmed up. The kitchen smelled like a church supper. Every pepper was its own self-contained dinner, neat and round and sitting in a pool of red sauce. Families in Ohio and Pennsylvania made these almost weekly because 1 pound of hamburger stretched across 6 peppers and fed the whole table. You did not need a side dish. The pepper was the bowl and the meal was inside it. Leftovers went into the refrigerator standing up, and the next day you reheated them in the oven, and they tasted even better because the rice had soaked up all the sauce overnight. Long before the wringer washer arrived with its rubber rollers and roaring engine, the iron wash pot was the center of laundry day. It sat on 3 legs over a wood fire in the yard, wide-mouthed and black with decades of use, and on Monday morning your grandmother had it going before the children were awake. White clothes went in first, sheets, pillowcases, undergarments, with a chunk of lye soap and a wooden paddle long enough to keep her arms clear of the steam. She boiled them 15 to 20 minutes, stirring, the water thickening with dissolved soil into something the color of weak broth. Stains that survived the board often didn't survive the boil. This method, bucking, in the old Scots-Irish laundry tradition that arrived in Appalachia with the original settlers, was practiced continuously in the region from the 1700s through the early 20th century. Some households kept the pot in the yard well into the 1950s, not because they had to, but because the boil got whites cleaner than the machine managed. She said the machine washed clothes. The pot made them honest. Number 24. Fried spam and eggs. Slice the spam thin, lay it flat in a hot skillet, and let it crisp until the edges turn dark and slightly curled. Crack 2 eggs into the same pan and cook them however the house preferred. That was supper. The spam came out salty and caramelized. The eggs stretched it into a full plate, and a piece of toast on the side soaked up whatever was left in the pan. In Hawaiian kitchens, this was standard fare any night of the week, and across the mainland it showed up in homes where the grocery run had not happened and nobody planned to make it happen before morning. The can sat in the pantry for months without going bad, which made it the last line of defense on nights when the refrigerator had given up before the family did. Before I go on, for the folks who have been cooking along with these old recipes and want them all gathered in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. It is a collection of recipes like the ones in this video, all in one book. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Leftover pintos never went to waste in a mountain kitchen, not when you could mash them, shape them into patties, and fry them in a hot skillet until the outside turned crisp and the inside stayed soft and warm. Bean cakes were the second life of a pot of soup beans, made the day after the original meal when the beans had thickened overnight in the refrigerator or on the back of the stove. You mashed them with a fork, mixed in a handful of cornmeal or flour to hold them together, and fried them flat in bacon grease. During the Depression, when a 12-cent bag of dried pintos could feed a family for 3 days, bean cakes extended that to 4. The first day was soup beans with cornbread. The second day was bean cakes fried for supper. Nothing wasted, nothing thrown out. Every calorie pulled from that single bag of dried beans. The cornmeal crust gave them a crunch the original beans never had, and that crunch made it feel like a different meal entirely. Fried cornbread hoe cakes were the sound of supper sizzling in a skillet. Cornmeal, water, salt, and a little grease were all you needed to turn a handful of nothing into a golden brown meal. Hillbilly kitchens loved this trick because it was fast, cheap, and never disappointed. You would drop spoonfuls of batter into the pan, listen for that familiar hiss, and wait for the edges to crisp. Hoe cakes were bread, but they were also pride, a way to make the table feel full even when meat was missing. They paired with beans, greens, and gravy, soaking up every last bit of flavor. No fork was needed, just hands and hunger. The smell alone could stop anyone passing by. Fried cornbread hoe cakes were the mountain version of comfort food, simple fried perfection that spoke louder than any recipe ever could. They were proof that flavor comes from fire, patience, and heart. Number 28. Fried apples and a single pork chop. One thin bone-in chop, 2 firm tart apples cored and sliced into half moons, a spoon of bacon grease, and a pinch of dark brown sugar. The chop fries first in the heavy pan, comes out to rest on the plate, and the apples go into the same pan with the drippings still warm. 8 minutes. They soften, brown at the edges, and turn the color of an October hillside. The chop goes back beside them. A serving for one fits on a saucer. Joseph Dabney documented this exact pairing in his book on Appalachian foodways, and Ronnie Lundy called it the most honest pork dish in the mountains. The apples were usually limber twigs or wine saps from the back orchard, varieties most grocery stores stopped carrying after the 1970s. It tastes like a cool morning on a wood porch. Number 18. Selling jars of home-canned green beans at the roadside. A hill country woman who put up 200 quarts in August thought nothing of setting a few jars on a table by the road or trading them at the country store. Green beans, corn, and stewed meat in mason jars were currency in a cash-poor country. Today, that simple sale is shut down cold, and the reason is deadly serious. Low-acid foods like green beans, corn, and any kind of meat create the perfect dark, airless home for the spores that cause botulism, one of the rare poisonings that can actually kill you. The bacteria only stay dormant when the acidity drops to a pH of 4.6 or below, and home green beans sit far above that line. So while a jar of pickles or jam can still be sold under most cottage food laws, low-acid canned goods are flatly excluded because they demand a pressure canning process the state will not certify in a home kitchen. The roadside bean stand that once helped pay the light bill is now against the rules. Fried rabbit sausage with buttermilk biscuits was Christmas breakfast that turned wild game into something special enough for holiday morning. Mountain families ground rabbit meat with pork fat, sage, black pepper, and salt, forming patties that fried crispy in cast iron. The sausage was lean from rabbit but rich from pork fat, creating perfect balance. Served alongside buttermilk biscuits, split and buttered, this was breakfast that required hunting skill and butchering knowledge. In Appalachian communities, Christmas morning meant rabbit sausage sizzling while biscuits baked, filling houses with savory smells. Children woke to this aroma, understanding Christmas began with food earned through work. The sausage was tender inside with crackling crust outside, its sage flavor marking it as celebration food. This represented mountain Christmas, wild game transformed into tradition, poverty turned into pride through skill and resourcefulness. Number 14. The fried catfish sandwich. The catfish came out of every creek, pond, and river bottom in the hill country. You caught it on a trot line or a cane pole baited with chicken liver, cleaned it on the bank, and carried it home in a bucket. The breading was cornmeal, salt, black pepper, and nothing else. You heated lard in a cast iron skillet until a pinch of cornmeal sizzled the second it hit the surface, and you laid the fillets in gently because a catfish fillet will fall apart if you handle it rough. The fish fried for about 4 minutes on each side until the cornmeal crust turned dark gold and the meat inside went white and flaky. You set the fillets on a piece of brown paper to drain, then laid them on white bread with a slice of raw onion and a squirt of yellow mustard. The bread went soft against the hot fish, and the cornmeal crust stayed crunchy where it pressed against the onion. Friday nights in the Ozarks and the Tennessee Valley, this was what people ate. Church fish fries served them by the hundreds. Families who lived near water ate catfish sandwiches twice a week because the fish was free and the cornmeal cost next to nothing. The combination of free protein and penny cornmeal made the fried catfish sandwich one of the most economical meals in the rural South. Commercial catfish farming changed everything in the 1980s. Farm-raised catfish tastes milder, cleaner, and nothing like the wild mud cat that made these sandwiches what they were. People who remember pulling a channel cat off a trot line at dawn and eating it fried on bread by noon know there is no substitute. Number 14. Making chow chow from the last things in the garden. "The garden corners make the best relish," she said every October. Your grandmother walked the rows on the last warm day of October, pulling green tomatoes the frost had not finished, small heads of cabbage, and cucumbers that had gone tough. She chopped everything fine, salted it heavy with 3 tablespoons of pickling salt to every 5 pounds, and hung it in a pillowcase from the porch rail overnight. By morning, the cloth had drained pale green water onto the porch boards in a slow, steady stream. She boiled the salted vegetables with vinegar, sugar, and mustard seed, ladled them into half-pint jars, and sealed the lids in a hot water bath. The relish on the cellar shelf turned a plate of pinto beans and cornbread into something different every supper from November through March. The cheapest condiment on the table was always the one the grocery store never sold. Number 12. Sour cream raisin pie. This pie is what you made in February, after the cow had calved and the milk was coming rich, and you had a crock of cultured sour cream on the cold shelf of the spring house. A cup of that sour cream, a cup of sugar, 2 beaten egg yolks, a heaped cup of dark raisins, a scraping of nutmeg, a crust underneath, a pale meringue piled on top made from the 2 whites, baked slow. The raisins plumped, the custard thickened. The meringue took a soft tan on its peaks. A woman in Breathitt County, Kentucky, wrote in her kitchen book in 1961 that this pie was worth the reputation her mother-in-law never gave her. Hillbilly women kept score in pies. The good ones knew. In the 1920s and 30s, white sugar was a luxury most mountain families saw only at Christmas, if then. What they had was sorghum, a tall cane grass that grew thick in the bottom fields and could be pressed, boiled, and reduced into a dark, heavy syrup for everything from biscuits to gingerbread to glazing a Christmas ham. The stalks were stripped by hand, fed through a mule-driven press, and the pale green juice collected in buckets. Then came hours of boiling in a long, shallow copper pan over wood fire, skimming green foam until the syrup turned thick and amber. African American families in the Appalachian coalfields built their own sorghum traditions, using it as a meat glaze, a baking ingredient, and a candy base. A good season filled enough jars to last October to June. The flavor was nothing like store-bought molasses, warmer, grassier, with a slight bitterness that told you it came from the field and not a factory. Number 16, pork chops and applesauce with shake and bake. 4 bone-in chops shaken in a paper bag of seasoned breadcrumbs and baked at 425 until the coating turned crisp. A jar of Mott's applesauce on the side, lukewarm, straight from the refrigerator. Shake and Bake hit shelves in 1965, and within 4 years, it was in roughly 1 in 3 American kitchens. The Brady Bunch made the line famous when Peter Brady said pork chops and applesauce in his Humphrey Bogart voice. The dish was Tuesday and Thursday food. It was simple. It was effective. By the 1990s, the box had moved to the bottom shelf. The chops thinned out. The applesauce got organic. Nobody under 40 knows the rhythm of shaking a bag, the small percussive sound it made. The sound of jars sealing was the sound of winter taken care of. That faint pop, one after another, coming from the counter where the ball jars cooled. Every lid that sucked down tight meant 1 more week your family would eat. The women started before dawn in August, standing over boiling water baths in kitchens with no air conditioning, peeling tomatoes until their fingers turned red and raw. Green beans, corn, peaches, pickled beets, chow chow relish. The cellar shelves filled row by row like a library of everything the garden had given. You learned which recipes needed a pressure canner and which ones could water bath. And you learned it the hard way if you got it wrong, because a jar of green beans sealed without enough heat could kill you. Now canning kits sell for $300, and TikTok videos with billions of views teach what used to pass from mother to daughter without a single word written down. Number 12. Codfish cakes. Salt cod soaked overnight in cold water, then flaked and mixed with mashed potato, a beaten egg, and black pepper. You shaped the mixture into thick patties and fried them in a skillet until both sides turned deep golden brown. In Catholic families across New England and the Mid-Atlantic, this was Friday dinner every single week. The church said no meat on Fridays, and salt cod was cheap and kept for months without refrigeration. The outside of each cake went crispy while the inside stayed soft and flaky. You served them with tartar sauce or a squeeze of lemon and a side of coleslaw. By the late 1970s, most families had stopped buying salt cod entirely, and codfish cakes went from a weekly ritual to something only grandmothers still knew how to make. Monday was not a suggestion. In Appalachian households from the 1920s through the 1960s, wash day fell on Monday the way sunrise fell in the East, without discussion, without exception. American domestic manuals as far back as the mid-1800s had established Monday as the accepted wash day, and the tradition held in mountain communities long after it had faded elsewhere. The clothes had been sorted and soaked Sunday evening, and by first light Monday she was already outside feeding the fire under the wash pot. The order was fixed. Whites in first while the water was cleanest, work clothes last when the suds were spent. If she washed on a Tuesday, the neighbors noticed. A clothesline standing empty on Monday afternoon told the whole road something was wrong inside. Sickness, a baby coming, grief. The rhythm of the week was built around that one day's labor, and the women who kept the household on something stronger than schedule. It was the last thing she managed before the hospital. The line stood empty every Monday after that, and the whole road understood without being told. Number 11. Baked sweet potato with butter. Scrub a sweet potato, poke it with a fork, and put it in the oven until the skin wrinkled and the sugars inside started to leak out and caramelize on the baking sheet. Split it open, drop a knob of butter into the center, and let the heat do the rest. The flesh turned soft and almost candy sweet without a grain of added sugar, and the butter pooled in the crevices and mixed with the orange pulp into something that tasted richer than it had any right to. In rural kitchens from North Carolina to Mississippi, sweet potatoes grew in the yard and stored in the root cellar through winter, which meant they were always there when nothing else was. A woman who put one in the oven at 5 in the afternoon had a full meal waiting by 6 without lifting another finger. Some sprinkled cinnamon across the top. Others ate it plain with just the butter and a pinch of salt, which brought out the sweetness the way salt always does when you let it. The strange thing about these meals is that the women who made them did not think of them as real dinners at all. A real dinner had a meat, a starch, a vegetable, and something sweet at the end. A real dinner took an hour. A real dinner meant somebody cared enough to plan. But the truth was simpler than that. Showing up in that kitchen at 6 o'clock when your entire body wanted to sit down in a chair and close its eyes and doing something, anything, with whatever was left on the shelf, that was caring too. These lazy dinners were small, quiet acts of persistence that nobody talked about, nobody photographed, and nobody put in a cookbook. But they happened, night after night, in kitchens all over this country, and everyone got fed. In the coal camps of West Virginia, potato soup meant something different than it did in town. There was no cream, no butter, no garnish. You peeled potatoes, 3 or 4 if you had them, cut them into rough chunks, dropped them in a pot of water with a chopped onion, and boiled them until the potatoes fell apart and thickened the broth on their own. Salt, black pepper, and that was it. Miners' wives through the 1930s and 40s stretched this into a 2-day meal by adding water and reheating it each evening. The soup got thinner every night, but it stayed warm, and warm mattered more than full when the house had no insulation and the fire burned low. She ladled it into the same chipped bowl every evening. After she passed, that bowl sat empty in the cabinet for years. Squirrel stew was born from the woods, not the market. A family that could bring down a squirrel had meat enough for the pot, and that was reason to be thankful. Dressed, chopped, and simmered with onions, potatoes, and carrots, it became a thick, rich stew that smelled like Sunday comfort. No one thought twice about it. Hunting was just part of living. The flavor was earthy and wild, something that no city meal could imitate. Children learned early that nothing caught went to waste, and every bite carried the story of skill and effort. When times were lean, squirrel stew brought warmth, protein, and pride. It was not fancy, but it was honest and filling, the kind of food that fed both body and spirit. Around the table, folks shared not just supper, but the satisfaction of making something good from the land itself. Number 30. Hoe cake with red-eye gravy. A piece of country ham about the size of a small saucer goes into a hot iron pan. 2 minutes aside is plenty, and the brown bits stuck to the iron are the whole point of the supper. A splash of black coffee deglazes the pan, and that thin red gravy is what gave the dish its name. The hoe cake is just yellow cornmeal, salt, and boiling water patted into a flat round and fried in the leftover ham grease until the edges turn the color of a copper penny. 1 ham slice, 1 hoe cake, 1 plate. That was supper in Madison County, North Carolina, on a Tuesday in November, and the woman eating it did not feel poor. She felt fed. The dish has lived in the mountain repertoire since the early 1800s, and a single portion costs about $1.50 at any country butcher. Number 21. Simmering supper in the old lead-glazed crockery. Those heavy redware crocks and bean pots, glazed to a deep honey shine, were the pride of many a hill kitchen and got handed down like heirlooms. Cooks slow-cooked pinto beans in them, soured kraut in them, and stored buttermilk and stewed tomatoes in them for days. The trouble lives in the glaze. When that old pottery was fired at too low or too uneven a heat, the lead never fully bonded into the glass surface, and it leaches straight into the food. Acidic dishes pull it out fastest, which means the very beans, kraut, and tomatoes those crocks were made for were the worst offenders. The Food and Drug Administration now warns flatly against cooking, serving, or storing food in any pottery that tests for leachable lead, and a single family in New York was poisoned this way as recently as the last few years. That cherished bean pot is now a hazard the agency tells you to retire. Wild rabbit in brown gravy was the Christmas centerpiece mountain families harvested from snowy hillsides. These were wild cottontails tracked through December snow, caught in box traps or shot cleanly. The rabbits were skinned carefully, jointed, and browned slowly in pork fat until golden. They simmered for hours with wild onions and black pepper until meat fell off the bone. The cooking liquid became rich gravy thickened with flour. Families served this over biscuits or alongside stored potatoes. In eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, wild rabbit meant Christmas protein that cost nothing, just skill and land knowledge. Children learned holiday meals came from work, not stores. The meat was tender and mild, each piece representing winter mornings spent hunting. This represented self-reliance and connection between mountain people and their environment, proving Christmas abundance didn't require money when you had resourcefulness pass through generations. Number 24. Sugar bread. White bread, a layer of butter, and a heavy pour of white sugar on top, folded in half. Some families used brown sugar. Some sprinkled cinnamon if they had it, but most did not. This was what you ate when the pantry was bare and the next check was still a week out. It showed up at kitchen tables across West Virginia, the Carolinas, and deep into the Tennessee hills from the 1930s through the 1970s. Mothers handed it to children and called it a treat because calling it what it was felt too heavy. The butter melted into the bread and the sugar gave you a rush that lasted about 20 minutes, and then you were hungry again. But for those 20 minutes, you were eating something sweet, and sweetness mattered when everything else was hard. Before I go further, for the folks who want more recipes like these all gathered in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. It is a cookbook full of the kind of meals your people actually made. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 17, making egg gravy over torn biscuit pieces. The pan smelled like a sermon on payday morning. Your grandmother melted a tablespoon of saved drippings into a hot black skillet, stirred in a heaping spoon of flour, and browned it for 2 minutes until the roux turned a deep, toasted color. She poured in equal parts milk and water, whisked it smooth as silk, cracked 1 egg into the simmering pan, and stirred until the white set into ribbons through the sauce, like ribbons of cream through black coffee. She tore the biscuits over each plate with her hands, ladled the hot gravy over the chunks, and the kitchen went quiet for 10 minutes while the children ate. It filled them, warmed your kitchen, and carried a coal miner through 8 hours underground. 1 egg, a spoon of grease, 2 cups of liquid, 5 plates cleared in under 15 minutes flat. Number 24, sorghum molasses cookies. You have to understand something about sorghum to understand why these cookies existed. Sorghum is not molasses. Sorghum is the juice pressed out of a tall cane-like grass, boiled down in a flat pan over a wood fire until it turns the color of dark honey and tastes like a field at dusk. A gallon of it in 1962 cost $1.50 from the neighbor up the road who owned the mule and the press. A gallon of white sugar cost 4 times that at the store in town, and town was a 2-hour drive. So you used what you had. Mrs. Arlie Burgess in Clay County, West Virginia, made a tin full of sorghum cookies every Saturday for 51 years. Flour, lard, sorghum, soda, ginger, a pinch of salt. She rolled them thin as a dime and baked them on the stove. The children got 2 each after supper. But her grandchildren, grown now, still say they have never tasted anything sweeter. That is not an exaggeration. That is memory doing what memory does. If lye soap kept the outside clean, goose grease kept the inside from falling apart. When a child came down with the croup in January, that barking, strangled cough, the first thing she reached for was a jar of rendered goose fat saved from fall, warmed by the stove and rubbed thick across the child's chest. A flannel cloth went over the top, pinned tight until morning. Some mothers mixed in turpentine or camphor. Others used groundhog oil for the worst congestion. The Foxfire books recorded over 200 chest poultice variations from the southern mountains. Goose grease, pine tar and soot, kerosene and lard, onion juice soaked into wool rags. None of it sounds pleasant. All of it worked well enough that families survived winters with no doctor within a day's ride. Your grandmother's hands smelled like camphor for months. You complained then. You would give anything to smell it now. Number 22, Swiss steak. A round steak pounded thin with the edge of a saucer, dredged in flour, browned in a heavy skillet, then braised for 2 hours with stewed tomatoes, green pepper, and onion until a fork could cut it. 49 cents a pound at the A&P in 1964. The technique was called Swissing because the meat got rolled between fluted rollers at the butcher counter to break the fibers. Every family had a Wednesday version. The gravy went over mashed potatoes or buttered noodles. By the time microwaves hit kitchens in the late 1970s, nobody had 2 hours for a weeknight braise anymore. And the dish that smelled like Wednesday across half of America began to fade. But you could still find it on the menu of small-town diners through 1991, listed under blue plate specials with mashed potatoes and green beans for $3.75. In the 1950s, if you smelled like ramps, people knew exactly where you came from and what you could not afford. That sharp, garlicky stink clung to your clothes and your breath for days, and it marked you as poor, as mountain, as someone who dug food out of the dirt instead of buying it at a store. The Cherokee had been harvesting ramps every spring for centuries before that stigma existed, pulling the wild leeks from shaded coves when the forest floor was still cold, eating them raw or fried with eggs and potatoes to thin the blood after a long winter. Ramp suppers were community events in West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, the first fresh green thing after months of dried beans and canned goods. Now those same ramps sell for $20 a pound at farmers markets in Brooklyn, and Sean Brock built part of his restaurant empire around Appalachian ingredients that used to embarrass the people who ate them. The mountains did not change. The price tag did. Number 22. American chop suey, elbow macaroni, ground beef, canned tomatoes, and a diced green pepper. That was the whole thing. You browned the beef, added the vegetables, stirred in the cooked noodles, and served it in bowls like pasta with ambition. In New England, they called it American chop suey. In the Midwest, it went by goulash. Down south, it barely had a name at all. The dish had nothing to do with Chinese cooking. The name stuck because anything tossed together fast with whatever you had counted as chop suey in the American imagination of the time. It tasted better the next day, reheated in a skillet with a little extra tomato stirred through. Most families made it once a week and never wrote down the recipe. The machine arrived and immediately demanded respect. Sears sold a gasoline-powered wringer washer in the late 1930s, a loud, fume-producing contraption that had to stay outside, and getting one meant you were doing a little better than your neighbors. The wringer was 2 rubber rollers set close together, and you fed wet clothes through to press the water out. Efficient. Also waiting for a lapse in attention. A button left buttoned jammed the rollers with a sound that dropped your heart. A braid that swung forward while you leaned in could be pulled through before you registered what was happening. She kept her hair pinned and her sleeves rolled tight on wash day, always, and made her daughters do the same. They thought she was being particular. She was being specific about a danger she had seen with her own eyes and never talked about directly. The electric wringer washers of the 1950s were quieter and safer, but the rules stayed exactly the same in her house. Rules that come from a real reason have a way of outlasting the machines that made them necessary. Number 8. Fried apples and smoked sausage. Slice a ring of smoked sausage into thick rounds and brown them in a cast iron skillet until the edges split and the fat pooled across the bottom of the pan. Push the sausage to one side, drop in peeled and sliced apples with a spoonful of butter and a shake of cinnamon, and let them cook in the drippings until they went soft and golden. The kitchen smelled like a smokehouse that somehow shared a wall with a pie cooling on a windowsill. In the Appalachian foothills and across the Ozarks, this combination showed up on weeknight tables from the first cold snap in October through the last hard frost in March. The sweetness of the apples pushed against the salt and smoke of the sausage, and the 2 flavors settled into each bite without either one winning. A grandmother who made this knew that a good skillet supper was just 2 or 3 ingredients that got along well in hot fat. The sausage arrived seasoned, the apples just needed heat, and together they filled a plate in 15 minutes with nothing wasted and nothing stored. When the nearest ocean was 500 miles away and fresh fish meant a creek full of catfish you didn't have time to catch, canned salmon was the answer. Salmon patties, canned salmon mixed with egg, cracker crumbs, and chopped onion, shaped into rounds and fried in a skillet, showed up on Friday supper tables across Appalachia and the rural South every week for decades. During the 1930s and 40s, a can of pink salmon cost less than 15 cents and provided enough protein to stretch across 2 meals for a family of 4. Coal mining families in West Virginia and eastern Kentucky relied on them because the company store stocked canned goods but rarely fresh meat. The patties fried best in a well-seasoned cast iron skillet with enough grease to come halfway up the sides, and you pressed them thin so the edges went crisp while the center stayed moist. The smell of canned salmon frying on a Friday evening was so specific to these kitchens that catching a trace of it decades later could stop you cold in a grocery aisle. Fried salt pork with gravy was the kind of meal that stuck to your bones and made you thankful for every bite. Salt pork was cheap and cured, tough until you fried it just right in a black skillet. Once it crisped, the leftover drippings turned into gold, stirred with flour and milk to make creamy white gravy that poured like silk. It covered biscuits, potatoes, or anything else that needed saving from plainness. For mountain folks, this dish turned poverty into pleasure. It filled bellies after long days in the fields and made Sunday mornings smell like grace. Salt pork was often the only meat on the table, but with that gravy, no one minded. The taste was bold, smoky, and honest, like the people who made it. A plate of fried salt pork reminded everyone that ingenuity could feed a family when the cupboard said otherwise. It was poor man's steak with rich man's flavor. Number 25. Killed lettuce over a hot-baked potato. A bowl of leaf lettuce, sliced green onions, and a little salt. Hot bacon grease with a splash of cider vinegar gets poured directly over the leaves, and they wilt down in seconds. The whole bowl tips onto a split-baked potato. One potato, one handful of lettuce, 2 strips of bacon broken in. The Foxfire books recorded this as a spring supper across the Blue Ridge and the Smokies, gathered from hill country grandmothers in Rabun County and Macon County in the early 70s. It is sharp, hot, and finished in the time it takes the potato to come out of the oven. A solo plate sets up in 5 minutes flat, and the lettuce can be from a kitchen window planter through most of the year. Number 25. The Backwoods Moonshine Still. Up the hollers, a copper still was as much a part of the kitchen as the cook stove, and nobody up there thought twice about it. A family ran corn mash through a pot still, caught the clear liquor off the worm, and used it to trade, to doctor a sore throat, or to splash into a fruitcake. It paid the taxes when crops failed and kept the cabinet stocked when the nearest store was a half-day mule ride away. Here is the catch. Distilling spirits at home is a federal crime under Title 26, Section 5601 of the United States Code, with no exception carved out for personal use. You can brew your own beer and ferment your own wine, but the moment that vapor condenses into liquor, you are looking at a felony carrying up to 5 years and a $10,000 fine. That self-stilled spirit the old folks poured so freely is now strictly off-limits. Pickled pig's feet were Christmas delicacy, transforming butchering scraps into something prized. When families butchered hogs in December, nothing was wasted, especially feet becoming treats after preparation. The feet were cleaned meticulously, boiled tender with bay leaves and peppercorns, then packed into stone crocks and covered with spiced vinegar heated with garlic and pepper. They cured for weeks, vinegar penetrating meat and softening cartilage until everything became tender and tangy. Served cold on Christmas morning, pickled feet were eaten with fingers, meat falling off bones while gelatinous texture melted on tongues. In rural communities throughout the South, these represented thrift elevated to tradition, using every part of hog and creating something delicious. Children learned to appreciate pickled feet as treats, not scraps. The vinegary tang cut through rich holiday meals. This proved mountain cooking was about transforming everything into something worth celebrating. Number 20. The fatback biscuit. Fatback is the slab of pure fat cut from the back of a hog, no meat in it at all. You sliced it thin, fried it in a dry skillet until it rendered and turned golden, then laid those crispy slices inside a split buttermilk biscuit. The grease that came out of the fatback went right back onto the biscuit. This was a working man's breakfast in the mountains of North Carolina and Virginia from the early 1900s through the 1960s. Loggers and miners ate it because the fat kept you full through a 10-hour shift when nothing else would. Nobody pretended it was health food. It was fuel, pure and simple, and it cost almost nothing because fatback was the cheapest cut the butcher sold. Number 23. Saving bacon grease in a tin can next to the stove. Saving every drop of bacon grease was the single most reliable trick in any hillbilly kitchen. She kept a Hills Brothers coffee can on the rear burner with cheesecloth over the top. Every morning, she poured the hot grease slowly through the cloth into the can. By Saturday, she had a half pint of clear amber fat that she used to fry cornbread, sear green beans, slick the biscuit pan, and start the milk gravy. 1 pound of bacon at the company store in 1964 ran 59 cents, and the grease was the cooking oil for the rest of the week. But she never bought lard, and she never bought shortening. The grease can never went empty because she never let it, and the woman who tended it that carefully made the rest of the kitchen budget stretch the same way. The Hills Brothers can held grease from Oscar Mayer bacon strips. Today, bacon costs around $6 a pound, and a bottle of vegetable oil costs almost $5. The same trick still cuts your kitchen budget in half. Number 9. Seafoam candy. Seafoam is divinity's sister, and the only real difference is the sugar. Brown sugar, not white. A cup of brown sugar, half a cup of corn syrup, a quarter cup of water, cooked hot, beaten into 1 egg white, dropped by spoonfuls. It comes out a soft caramel tan with a crackly outside and a melting, airy inside. The children got 1 each on Christmas morning. A grandmother in Fentress County, Tennessee, kept her seafoam in a round tin lined with waxed paper and gave a piece to every child who knocked on the door between Christmas and Twelfth Night. In a hollow where cash money was short, that tin was one of the richest things in the house. If dried apples kept the sweet side of winter alive, the salt-cured ham in the smokehouse held body and soul together. Curing began within hours of the kill, while the meat was still warm, and demanded a patience no modern kitchen knows. Hams and shoulders were rubbed with salt mixed with brown sugar and black pepper, then packed into barrels or laid on wooden shelves. The old-timers tested the brine by dissolving salt in water until a raw egg floated, and that told them the cure was strong enough. Helen Hoggart of Bertie County said the ham sat in salt for 21 days, no shortcuts. Then you washed it clean, rubbed it with molasses and pepper, and hung it by wire in the smokehouse. The wire kept the mice off. The pepper kept the flies away. You sliced from that ham all winter long, and every morning the kitchen smelled like nothing any store-bought country ham has ever matched. Number 17, glazed ham loaf with pineapple. A 2-pound loaf made from ground cured ham mixed with ground pork, bound with breadcrumbs and an egg, baked in a ring mold, crowned with Dole pineapple rings and brown sugar that caramelized in the last 20 minutes. Pennsylvania Dutch country invented it. Church suppers from York to Lancaster served it on long tables every other Sunday. Through the 1960s, butchers ground their ham trimmings into loaves wrapped in white paper and labeled by hand for housewives to take home for about $1 a pound. By 1985, most butcher counters had been replaced by plastic-wrapped meat in the cold case. The ham loaf went with them. The pineapple ring still shows up on the occasional Easter ham, but it is a ghost of a ghost. You will not find a butcher who grinds his own ham loaf mix in any chain grocery store today. Before there was a refrigerator, there was a smokehouse, a small wooden building, sometimes no bigger than a closet, set away from the house where the heat would not reach. After hog killing, the hams and shoulders hung from hooks in the rafters, and a slow fire of hickory or oak smoldered on the dirt floor below, filling the room with a smoke so thick you could barely see the meat through it. The curing took months. Salt packed into the flesh first, drawing out moisture, and then the smoke finished the job, sealing the surface, killing bacteria, building a flavor that no liquid smoke from a bottle has ever come close to matching. You knew the meat was ready by the color and the feel of it, not by a thermometer. The old men could press a thumb into a ham and tell you whether it needed another week. Artisan smokehouses now sell heritage smoked country ham for $70 a pound. The process has not changed, only the customer has. Number 11, hot dish, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas. Everybody in those states knew exactly what this was. Ground beef browned in a skillet, mixed with a can of cream of mushroom soup and a can of green beans, poured into a casserole dish and topped with a layer of frozen tater tots. You baked it until the tots turned crispy and the filling bubbled underneath. Not casserole, not a bake. Hot dish. The name was regional and the loyalty was fierce. Church basements across the upper Midwest served some version of it at every potluck, every funeral, every Wednesday night supper. Some families used corn instead of green beans. Others added cheese on top. But the tater tots were the constant. You did not mess with the tater tots. That was the rule. Sorting laundry by color, whites here, darks there, was a city habit. The women who washed on a board in the 1940s sorted by something more practical: how dirty the clothes actually were. Delicate items and Sunday whites went into the tub first when the water was clean and hot and the soap was at full strength. Then the everyday clothes, the work dresses, the school shirts, then the overalls. Then at the end, when the water had already gone dark gray and the lather was spent, came the barn work. Clothes that had been in mud and engine grease and things nobody named. Running the cleanest clothes through spent water ruined them. Running the dirtiest clothes through fresh water wasted it. In a household where every bucket had to be hauled and every stick of firewood had to be split, that sequence wasn't preference. It was arithmetic. The calculation of a family that couldn't afford to be wasteful with either the water or the mourning. The city sorted by color. The farm sorted by cost. Number 25. Pimento cheese on crackers. Open the jar, spread it across a row of saltines, and call it done. In kitchens across the South, pimento cheese sat in the refrigerator the way ketchup did. Always there, never questioned. A grandmother who pulled it out at 6 in the evening was not admitting defeat. She was using the sharpest tool in her drawer. The cheese was tangy, the pimentos gave it color, and the crackers kept the whole thing from needing a plate if nobody felt like washing one. Some women made their own from a block of sharp cheddar, a jar of pimentos, and enough mayonnaise to hold it together. Others bought it from the deli counter at the Piggly Wiggly because the day had already taken everything they had. Either way, it went from refrigerator to table in under a minute, and the family ate without complaint because they knew what that jar on the counter meant. Tonight, the kitchen was closed. The tomato had to be warm from the garden, not the refrigerator, never the store, and sliced thick enough that the juice ran down your wrist when you bit into the sandwich. 2 slices of soft white bread, a heavy spread of mayonnaise, thick rounds of a tomato still holding the heat of the afternoon sun, and enough salt to make the flavor crack open. This was lunch and sometimes supper across the entire American South. A meal so simple that writing it down felt insulting to the people who made it. Hellmann's, first mass distributed in the 1920s, became the only acceptable brand. Using anything else was grounds for a kitchen argument that could last a whole summer. The sandwich existed only during tomato season. When the last vine died in September, it vanished, and no winter tomato from a grocery store could bring it back. Soup beans and fatback were more than supper. They were the week's anchor. The pot would simmer all day on the stove, filling the cabin with that smoky, familiar scent of slow-cooked beans and pork fat. Fatback, a cheap cut from the back of a hog, gave those beans their flavor and a bit of grease for strength. In the Appalachian Hills, this was a one-pot wonder that worked hard for families who worked harder. You could ladle it over cornbread, stretch it with onions or greens, and feed everyone until Saturday. There was pride in scraping that pot clean, because it meant you got through another week without wasting a thing. Each scoop was proof that simple food could keep you full and happy without costing much more than time. Some say it tasted like home itself, the kind of comfort no restaurant can serve. Those old soup beans told the story of mountain thrift and heart in every bite. Number 20. Brown beans with a slice of raw onion. The same pinto pot as number 22, but cooked plainer and served with a thick slice of white onion laid right on top of the beans. A small piece of cornbread on the side. Hill country families in McMinn County ate this 2 nights a week from October to April. The onion sweats into the broth and turns the whole bowl into something sharper than its parts. For one person, a coffee mug of beans and 1 slice of onion is a meal that a working hand could finish standing up. The leftover broth goes into a thermos for the next day's lunch, and nothing in the pot ever ends up in the chicken bucket. The dish is what a hill widow eats on the days when nothing else needs doing. Number 23, the home hog killing and the meat that went out the back door. When the first hard frost hit, whole communities gathered for hog killing day, and the work fed more than one family. A man would dress out his hog, smoke the hams, render the fat, and pass cuts to a neighbor who paid him back with eggs or a few dollars. That swapping kept everyone fed through the lean months. But under the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the rules turn on the sale, not the size of it. The moment money or barter changes hands for uninspected meat, it becomes a federal violation, even between neighbors of 40 years. The custom exemption only covers an animal slaughtered for the owner's own table, and the person eating it had to own the live hog first. So the friendly backdoor trade that kept a hollow fed is now squarely against the law. Possum roasted with sweet potatoes was Christmas dinner that filled mountain families with pride. These weren't desperate meals, but traditional feasts prepared with care. The possums were caught in late fall after feeding on persimmons and acorns, giving meat surprisingly sweet flavor. The cleaning was meticulous, with possums scrubbed thoroughly and parboiled to remove wild taste. Then they were stuffed with sweet potatoes, onions, and herbs before slow roasting in Dutch ovens. The sweet potatoes absorbed rich juices while skin turned crispy golden. In North Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia hollows, Possum Christmas meant honoring traditions stretching back generations. Grandmothers taught daughters proper preparation, passing knowledge connecting families to ancestors. The meat was tender and slightly sweet. Served with cornbread and greens, this was mountain fine dining representing cultural identity stronger than judgment. Number 17. The poke salad and egg sandwich. Pokeweed grows wild across the American South, and in the hills it was one of the first green things to come up in spring. But you had to know what you were doing. The raw plant is poisonous. You picked the young leaves before they got too big, boiled them in 3 changes of water to pull the toxins out, drained them, and fried them in bacon grease with scrambled eggs. The cooked greens tasted something like spinach, but earthier, and layered on bread with the eggs they made a sandwich that tasted like the woods themselves. Old-timers in the Ozarks and along the Appalachian ridges knew exactly when to pick poke and exactly how long to boil it. That knowledge passed from mother to daughter for generations. Today, most people walk right past pokeweed without recognizing it, and the sandwich walked away with them. Number 22. Buying chicken backs and necks for scraps. Buying the bony parts of a chicken instead of the breast was the trick that fed twice as much for a third of the price. The butcher trimmed the parts the town families never wanted and sold them by the pound. They went into a heavy iron pot with cold water, half an onion, and a celery rib. 3 hours of simmer pulled every shred of meat off the bone. Spoonfuls of biscuit dough fell into the broth. The pot turned into tender shredded chicken, thick yellow broth, and pillowy dumplings. An old hen makes the strongest stock. Number 13. Corncob jelly on a cold biscuit. Here is another one that will surprise you. After supper in September, a hillbilly woman did not throw her corn cobs to the hogs. Not yet. She boiled 6 cobs in a pot of water for a full hour, strained out a pale amber liquid that smelled faintly of corn silk, added sugar and a box of powdered pectin, and poured it into jelly jars. Corn cob jelly, mock honey. Poor woman's gold. It tasted, people said, very close to real honey, though honey was $3 a jar at the store and corncob jelly cost nothing but time. Spread thick on a cold split biscuit, warmed briefly on the stovetop, it was a real dessert at breakfast. A family in Pike County, Kentucky, put up 40 pints of corncob jelly every fall in 1953. They ate the last jar in May. Not one of the 8 children ever knew they were eating cobs. She peeled them in one long spiral, a skill learned by doing it 10,000 times, and sliced each apple thin enough to dry but thick enough to hold on the string. The slices were threaded on cotton and hung behind the wood stove, or spread on racks in the sun and brought inside at night. Dried right, those apples lasted all winter, rehydrated into fried slices sizzled in butter for breakfast, simmered into apple butter thick enough to stand a spoon in, or soaked for a Christmas stack cake. The peelings were never discarded. They were boiled into apple water, a mildly sweet drink, or reduced into thin vinegar for pickling. Every scrap found a second life. The women who dried them kept no timers and owned no thermometers. They knew a slice was ready by the way it bent between their fingers, leathery but not brittle. That feel cannot be taught from a book. Number 20. Tuna noodle casserole. A can of chicken of the sea, a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup, a bag of egg noodles, a handful of frozen peas, and a crushed potato chip topping baked until the edges browned. A 1959 Federal Fisheries Survey found that 8 out of 10 American households served canned tuna once a week, and the casserole sat at the top of that list. Through the 1960s, it was the dish a working mother slid into the oven before she changed out of her work clothes. The whole thing cost about 90 cents and fed 5. Picture the smell of cream of mushroom hitting the egg noodles in a galley kitchen in Wichita on a Tuesday in 1966. It survives in church potlucks but rarely on weeknight tables. The frozen peas have been replaced by takeout, the noodles by penny, and the casserole by nothing in particular. The recipe is still on the back of the Campbell's can. Almost nobody reads the back of the can anymore. Nothing was thrown away. Not the tongue, not the feet, not the brains, not the intestines. When a hog was butchered in Appalachia, every part of that animal had a destination. The head went into souse meat, the organs into liver mush or scrapple, the intestines were cleaned and stuffed for sausage casings or boiled into chitterlings, and the blood became blood pudding. Even the bladder got saved. Children blew it up like a balloon. The fat rendered to lard, the bones simmered into broth, the skin fried into cracklings. Waste was not a moral position. It was math. A family that threw away the feet of a hog was a family that did not understand how close they were to going hungry. Michelin-starred restaurants now charge $40 for roasted bone marrow on toast and call it nose-to-tail dining, a philosophy that poor families practiced without ever giving it a name. Number 18. Macaroni and tomatoes. You boiled elbow macaroni until it was soft, drained it, and stirred in a can of stewed tomatoes with all the juice, a pat of butter, salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar to cut the acid. That was the whole recipe. Some mothers added a handful of diced onion fried in the butter first. Others crumbled a few saltine crackers over the top. The dish came together in the time it took to boil water, and it tasted like something between a soup and a casserole. Warm and simple and slightly sweet from the tomatoes. This was the dinner nobody talked about because it barely qualified as cooking, but it showed up on tables across the Ohio Valley every single week. It was the filler meal, the one between grocery trips, the one that used two things every pantry already held. The third tub held was an optical illusion. Laundry bluing had been in American homes since before the Civil War, and Mrs. Stewart's concentrated liquid bluing, first sold in Minneapolis on July 30, 1883, was still on laundry shelves a century later because it worked in a way nothing else replicated. White fabric yellows with age and washing. The bluing countered that shift not by removing the yellow, but by adding the faintest trace of blue, so faint the eye read the combination as brilliant white. A typical Appalachian wash setup kept a separate bluing tub as the final rinse. The water tinted that thin, clear sky blue that meant whites were finished. Too much bluing turned the sheets faintly lavender, and you heard about it. The right amount was a few drops in a full tub of cold water, barely visible, just present. She held the bottle up to the light before she poured, tilting it until she could see the color shift. Getting it wrong once was enough to learn it forever. Before chlorine bleach was widely available, the sun did the work. Spreading wet white linens on clean grass in full morning sunlight was a bleaching method Appalachian and rural Southern households used continuously from the colonial period into the 1940s, and in isolated mountain communities beyond. The science is simple. Sunlight activates oxygen in the moisture held in the fabric, and that oxygen breaks down the compounds responsible for yellowing. Grass adds trace acids from dew that assist the process. The combination was gentle enough that it could be repeated weekly without weakening the fibers the way chlorine treatments did over time. You laid the sheets flat, overlapping nothing, and left them until they dried almost completely, then brought them in still slightly damp for ironing. Heavy, dew-covered grass worked better than dry. A cloudy day was wasted effort. She knew the difference between a sun worth using and one that was only decorating the sky, and she planned wash day around it the way a farmer planned planting. Number 4. Canned ravioli. Open the can, pour it into a pot, heat it on the stove for a few minutes, and serve it in a bowl. Chef Boyardee sold millions of those cans across the country, and a fair number of them got opened on nights when the original plan for supper had already fallen apart by 5 o'clock. The ravioli was soft, the sauce was sweet, and the whole thing seemed engineered to be acceptable to every child who ever sat at a kitchen table. Grandmothers did not serve this with pride or ceremony. They served it with speed. The can opener did the work, the stove did the warming, and nobody at the table said a word of complaint because the food was hot and the wait had been short. On a night when cooking felt like more than anyone should be asked to do, A can of ravioli and a glass of cold milk was enough to call the whole matter settled. But before anything could be stretched or seasoned, someone had to know what was safe to eat from the ground, and poke salad was the test that separated mountain cooks from everyone else. Phytolacca americana, pokeweed, grew wild along fence rows and ditch banks across the Appalachian South, and in early spring the young shoots were one of the first greens available to families who had eaten nothing fresh since autumn. The plant was toxic if handled wrong. You boiled the leaves 3 separate times, draining and replacing the water each round to pull the poison out before the greens were safe to eat. After the 3rd boil, you fried them in bacon grease with salt, and they turned dark, tender, and rich, tasting like a cross between spinach and asparagus. Cherokee and rural Appalachian families had been preparing poke this way for generations, and the knowledge passed by standing at the stove, not from any book. One wrong step, skipping a boil, picking leaves too mature, and the dish could make you sick. You either knew how or you didn't touch it. Beans and taters were what kept mountain families going when there was little else to count on, the kind of meal that stretched far and satisfied deep. Pinto beans simmered low and long, softening with salt, fatback, or even just water when meat was short. Meanwhile, potatoes waited nearby, boiled, mashed, or fried crisp to turn a pot of beans into a full supper. Together, they made a plate that felt heavier than hunger and warmer than hardship. The beans brought body, the potatoes brought comfort, and the combination brought peace after long days. Mountain folks never needed fancy seasonings or sides. They just needed food that filled and soothed. Children knew the smell of beans simmering before they even came through the door. It was the smell of stability, of knowing you would eat, even in hard years. Beans and taters taught patience, gratitude, and the quiet pride that comes from surviving together. It was more than supper. It was a ritual that reminded families what mattered. Every forkful told the same story. Work hard, share what you have, and be thankful for enough. It was food for living, not showing off, and no one ever left hungry. Number 23 on this list is leather breeches beans. Green beans threaded on cotton string with a sewing needle hung from a rafter in the back room in late August and dried for 6 weeks until they rattle when the wind moves through the house. The whole place smelled like cured hay for the first week. By Christmas, a handful went into a pot with water, a pinch of salt, and a thumb of side meat, and they swelled back to something close to their summer selves. The flavor is concentrated, smoky, almost like a green raisin. Verley Greer kept a string of them on the porch beam every winter, and Foxfire interviewers found the same string in nearly every old kitchen they walked into through the 70s. For one bowl, a half cup of dried beans yields a full single supper. The technique itself is what is forgotten, not the bean. Number 13, gathering wild mushrooms to cook and sell. After a warm rain, the woods filled with morels, chanterelles, and chicken of the woods, and a sharp-eyed forager could fill a basket in an afternoon. Those mushrooms went into the skillet with butter and onions, and the extras got carried to the country store or the diner in town for a little money. That open trade is now fenced in tight. Under the FDA food code that most states follow, any wild mushroom offered for sale or served in a restaurant must be individually inspected and identified as safe by a certified mushroom expert. A handful of states allow it only with that trained certification, and several refuse foraged mushrooms outright as coming from an unapproved source. The reason is plain. One misidentified cap can kill, and there is no antidote for some of them. So the basket of wild mushrooms a forager once sold off the tailgate now demands a credential the old woods-wise gatherers never had. Pork backbone and dumplings was Christmas comfort food that transformed butchering remnants into soul-warming celebration. The backbone, cut from hogs during December slaughter, was meaty enough to flavor broth but cheap enough for everyday tables. The bones simmered for hours with onions and black pepper until meat fell away tender. Then dumplings were dropped into bubbling broth. Flour, lard, and buttermilk rolled thin and cut into strips. They puffed up while cooking, absorbing rich pork flavor and creating thickness. In rural communities throughout the South, Backbone and dumplings meant Christmas thrift elevated to tradition. Families gathered around steaming pots, spooning dumplings and tender pork into bowls. This wasn't fancy food, but it was deeply satisfying, the kind of meal that warmed you from inside while snow fell outside. The dumplings were tender and rich, the pork sweet and falling apart soft. This represented mountain Christmas, making celebration from what you had, turning necessity into tradition passed through generations. Number 11. The fried rabbit sandwich. Rabbit was the most common wild meat in the hills. You hunted them with a single-shot .22 or caught them in a box trap built from scrap lumber. The meat was lean and mild, somewhere between chicken and pork, but finer grained than either one. You soaked the pieces in salted water overnight, dredged them in seasoned flour, and fried them in lard until the crust turned deep brown. A fried rabbit leg or a piece of backstrap on white bread with salt and pepper was a Saturday supper in the Appalachian foothills from the 1920s through the 1960s. Boys learned to hunt rabbit before they learned to drive. The fried rabbit sandwich disappeared when the woods got smaller and the supermarkets got bigger, and a whole generation grew up never knowing what wild game tasted like between two slices of bread. There is a particular kind of knowledge that lives in the hands. Not in books, not in classrooms, but in the fingers that know how hot the grease should be before the bread goes in, how thin to slice the ham so it curls at the edges, how much pressure to put on a biscuit so it splits clean without crumbling. That knowledge was passed at kitchen tables and wood stoves and open fires for generations, and it was never written down because nobody thought it needed to be. It was just how things were done. When the last person who knew vanished, the sandwich vanished with them. Not because the ingredients disappeared, but because the hands that made it right were gone. That is what we actually lost here, not recipes. Hands. Number 6. Soaking dried apples through January for fried apple pies. A pillowcase of dried stamen or winesap apple slices hung in the back room of every farmhouse from October through April. She peeled 3 bushels of fall apples in September, sliced them paper thin, laid them on screen frames in the smokehouse loft for 10 days, then bagged the leathery slices into pillowcases and hung them out of reach of the mice. By January, the cellar was bare, but the apple bag was still full, and the children knew it. She soaked a cup of slices in warm water overnight, drained them, and stewed them with sugar and cinnamon until they collapsed into a dark amber filling. She rolled Pillsbury biscuit dough into small circles, spooned the filling onto one half, folded them into half moons, and crisped them in hot drippings until the crust browned. 6 fried pies for under 15 cents in 1964. Today, a sack of dried stamen apples costs you around $6 and still makes the same pies in your kitchen. The same skillet, the same smell that woke the children before the rooster. Number 21. Blackberry jam cake with caramel icing. The blackberries came from the fence line at the back of the tobacco patch. Every July, a grandmother would send 5 or 6 children out with lard buckets tied around their waists with baler twine and tell them not to come back until every bucket had a dark, heavy bottom. She spent the next 2 weeks making jam. A quart jar held about 14 cents worth of sugar and a summer's worth of work. That jam went into the cake at Christmas. 3 layers, spiced with cinnamon, allspice, and clove, buttermilk for tang, a full pint of blackberry jam folded into the batter. Over it all, a sheet of caramel icing poured hot so it set into a thin sugar shell you had to crack with the side of your fork. Every serious Kentucky grandmother had a jam cake recipe and she did not share it. Not in writing. Not even with her own daughters, some of them, until the day she knew she was dying. You held the spool of heavy thread steady while she pushed a darning needle straight through each green bean pod, one after another, until the string hung 4 feet long with Kentucky half-runners. Leather breeches, she called them, or shuck beans, depending on which hollow you came from. The practice likely arrived with German settlers from the Palatinate, though Cherokee households had been drying beans on rawhide cord long before Europeans reached these mountains. Hung from the porch rafters or behind the wood stove, the pods shriveled until they looked like tiny pairs of worn-out trousers, brown and wrinkled. Come January, she soaked them overnight, dropped in a chunk of fatback, and simmered for hours. The taste was nothing like fresh beans, deeper, earthier, almost meaty. Some families tucked a dried hot pepper into the storage sack to keep insects out. You can buy the beans and try it yourself, but the flavor is never quite right without her hands on the thread. Number 23, liver and onions. A pound of sliced calf liver dredged in seasoned flour, seared in bacon drippings, and smothered in onions cooked until they collapsed. Mashed potatoes on the side, a glass of milk for the kids who knew better than to argue. Through the 1960s, your grandmother kept liver on the rotation every other Thursday because it was cheap and what the doctor told a tired wife to feed her husband. The dish disappeared because the children who choked it down vowed never to serve it themselves. By 1985, most butchers had stopped carrying it in the front case. What most people miss about Thursday liver is how completely a weeknight staple could vanish in 20 years. One generation ate it without question. The next refused to even smell it. She kept it in a crock on the counter, fed it flour and water every morning like a living thing. Because it was. That sourdough starter had been in the family longer than the farmhouse. Her mother gave it to her the day she married, wrapped in a cloth inside a jar, and her mother's mother had done the same before that. The bread it made was dense and sour and nothing like what came from a store, and if you forgot to feed it, if you let it go cold too long, you lost something that could not be replaced by starting over. When the pandemic hit and every person in America suddenly wanted to bake sourdough, Appalachian women shook their heads. They had never stopped. The starters they tended were not a trend. They were an inheritance. You can buy a dehydrated starter online now for $15, but it will not carry the taste of a kitchen where the same hands fed the same culture for 50 years without missing a morning. Number 13. Ring bologna dinner. The butcher sold it in a horseshoe-shaped loop, and you brought it home and sliced it into thick rounds. You browned the slices in a skillet until the edges curled and crisped, then served them alongside boiled potatoes and sauerkraut from a jar. In the upper Midwest and parts of Pennsylvania, this was a standard Tuesday night. The bologna had more flavor than a hot dog and cost about the same. Some families simmered the whole ring in a pot of water with potatoes and cabbage, like a poor man's version of a boiled dinner. Others fried the slices and served them with baked beans. Either way, it was a meal built around a piece of processed meat that most grocery stores still carry today, but almost nobody thinks of as dinner anymore. It cost a morning's fire to heat and a full afternoon to use, and not one drop went to waste. The first rinse water, warm and slightly soapy, went onto the kitchen garden. Beans and squash and tomatoes didn't mind a trace of soap. In fact, it helped knock back the aphids working the underside of the leaves. The second rinse water, cooler and cleaner, went to the hog pen or down the drain hole. The wash water itself, heavy with gray suds and a week's accumulated grime, scrubbed the porch boards before it soaked into the dirt. Nothing was hauled twice. Every bucket served its purpose in descending order, from cleanest use to dirtiest, until it was spent. A family that hauled every drop from the well had no intention of making the trip more times than the work required. Nothing was hauled twice. That was not a philosophy. That was the whole system. Number 13. Vienna sausages and crackers. Peel back the lid of that small can. Dump the little sausages onto a plate. Line up a sleeve of saltine crackers beside them and eat them cold. No cooking, no heating, no effort beyond pulling the tab. The sausages were soft and salty and packed in a broth that clung to your fingers, and the crackers gave them just enough crunch to feel like something more than a snack. The whole meal sat on a single plate and left nothing to wash but that plate and a fork. Working men ate these on lunch breaks in the field and at factory benches. But they showed up on supper tables too, on nights when the stove stayed cold because the woman who usually stood in front of it simply could not bring herself to turn it on. The jar of bacon grease beside the stove was the most important ingredient in the kitchen, and nobody who grew up in these houses ever threw it away. Fried potatoes and onions cooked in saved bacon grease was a meal that appeared on tables across the Appalachian South 3 or 4 nights a week. Potatoes sliced thin, a rough chopped onion, and a heavy spoonful of drippings from that jar. all pressed flat in a cast iron skillet and cooked without stirring until the bottom turned golden and crisp. You flipped it in sections, not all at once, and the onions went sweet and dark against the edges of the potatoes. In the 1950s, a 10-pound bag of potatoes cost around 35 cents, and a single bag could stretch across a full week of suppers. The grease was free, saved from breakfast, from Sunday's fatback, from every strip of bacon that ever touched that pan. Nobody measured. You scooped until the skillet looked right. That instinct died with the women who owned those jars. Fried bologna sandwiches were the poor man's steak, but no one eating them ever complained because they hit every craving just right. Thick pink slices of bologna slapped down on a hot iron skillet and sizzled until the edges curled like little cups, blistering enough to draw out that smoky, salty bite everyone loved. The smell alone could make an empty kitchen feel full. Add a swipe of yellow mustard, a slice of onion, and 2 soft pieces of white bread, and you had a meal that worked for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It was cheap, fast, and always satisfying. Kids carried them in brown paper bags to school, and grown men packed them for long days in fields, mines, or mills. In the hills, fried bologna sandwiches were as dependable as sunrise. Simple proof that flavor never depended on price. The grease soaked through napkins, but no one minded. It was comfort food at its best. When money was thin, this sandwich filled both belly and spirit, turning hard times into something a little easier to swallow. It was fried, humble, and proud, a true taste of mountain living that never needed dressing up to feel right. Number 18 is chicken and dumplings from a single hen. A whole stewing hen poached in salted water with a celery rib and an onion until the meat falls off the bone. Strip the bird, roll out flat dumplings the thickness of a nickel, cut them into squares with a butter knife, and drop them into the broth one at a time so they cook through without sticking. One hen yields 4 single suppers, and the remaining dumplings freeze in pint jars for the next 2 lunches. Mountain families did not waste a bird, and the modern freezer-to-bowl version of this dish is closer to what an Appalachian widow always did than to anything in a chain restaurant. The broth itself becomes a thermos of warmth the next morning. Number 14, hunting a deer for the table and selling the surplus. A buck taken in the fall fed a hill family through the worst of winter, and there was nearly always more venison than one household could eat. So the extra got sold or swapped down the road, smoked sausage for cash, a hindquarter for a debt. Market hunting like that is now almost entirely outlawed. The Federal Lacey Act, first passed in 1900, makes it illegal to sell, transport, or trade any wildlife taken in violation of state or federal game law. The instant you sell wild venison across a state line, or sell a deer taken out of season, a simple swap becomes a federal crime, and once the value tops $350, it climbs to a felony. The casual sale of wild meat that once carried families through the cold months is now one of the oldest prohibitions on the books. Persimmon pudding with hard sauce was Christmas dessert that captured wild sweetness of mountain autumn. Persimmons had to be gathered after first frost when they became soft and intensely sweet, their astringency gone. The fruit was pressed through sieves to create smooth pulp mixed with flour, eggs, milk, spices, and molasses. Baked slowly, the pudding emerged dark and dense, its texture somewhere between cake and custard. Hard sauce, butter and sugar beaten until fluffy, flavored with vanilla or whiskey, melted over warm pudding, creating rich contrast. In mountain communities, persimmon pudding represented patience and knowledge, knowing when persimmons were ready, understanding how to preserve their flavor. The pudding was deeply spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, its persimmon sweetness unlike anything else. This was Christmas dessert that couldn't be rushed or bought, requiring understanding of seasons and willingness to wait for nature's timing. Number 25, the banana and mayonnaise sandwich. Take a ripe banana, slice it lengthwise, lay the halves on a piece of soft white bread, spread Duke's mayonnaise on the other slice, and press it together. That was lunch in the hills of eastern Kentucky and all through the Ozarks. The banana gave you sweetness and the mayonnaise gave you fat, and together they made something that sounds wrong until you try it. Grocery stores sold more bananas than any other fruit in America by the 1940s, and in the hollers where meat was scarce, a banana sandwich cost less than a nickel. Kids took them to school wrapped in wax paper. Old men ate them on the porch after supper. It was not fancy. It was not trying to be. It was a meal that asked nothing of you except hunger. Number 25. Stretching ground beef with oatmeal in the meatloaf pan. Stretching the meat was the simplest move in any hillbilly kitchen. A cup of rolled oats soaked in cold milk stretched a pound of chuck across 2 suppers. She mixed everything in a wooden bowl, packed it into a buttered pan, and baked it slow. What I didn't expect about a hillbilly meatloaf is that the milk soak does the work, not the meat itself. The oats need 10 minutes in the milk before the meat goes in, or the loaf falls apart cold the next morning. Number 11. Shoe fly pie. The shoe fly pie crossed into Appalachia from the Pennsylvania Dutch country along the old Route 219, carried down the spine of the mountains by traveling peddlers and German-speaking settlers looking for farmland. By the 1920s, it had quietly become a staple in parts of Preston and Randolph counties in West Virginia. A cup of molasses, a cup of boiling water, a teaspoon of soda, a cup of flour crumbled with butter and brown sugar into sandy crumbs. The molasses went into the unbaked crust. The crumbs went over the top. It baked into a dark, sticky, cake-crumbed wonder of a pie. The name came from the habit of setting the pies out to cool on a porch rail, where flies had to be shooed off the sugar. A whole pie, in 1931, cost a dime to make. It fed a family of 7 with seconds. Nobody talks about how loud they were. A corn shuck mattress crackled every time you moved. Every roll, every twitch sent a dry rustling through the room like someone wadding up newspaper. But they were warm and free, and before cotton mattresses reached the mountains, they were what you had. After harvest, the husks were stripped, sorted for the driest, and stuffed tight into a ticking cover sewn from flour sacks. A well-packed shuck mattress held its shape for a season. By late winter, the shucks had flattened into something almost comfortable, just in time to dump them and start fresh. Kids shared these beds 3 deep, and the rule was simple. Whoever moved the least slept the best because every rustle woke the others. Brothers argued about it for decades. The sound of dry corn husks still makes certain people over 70 stop and smile. Number 25. Tomato aspic salad. A ring of tomato juice, gelatin, and finely chopped celery unmolded onto an iceberg leaf with a dollop of Hellmann's mayonnaise dropped in the center. Hostesses called it a salad because it was cold and it jiggled. It first appeared on suburban dinner tables in the late 1950s and held its place through the early 1960s as the marker that a housewife could afford a refrigerator and the time it took to chill 3 layers. Imagine a copper ring mold sweating in a Frigidaire next to a glass dish of deviled eggs. The Jell-O brand even sold a seasoned tomato flavor in the 1960s, packaged for exactly this dish at 23 cents a box. By 1968, Better Homes started running fewer molded salads and more crisp greens, and the aspic ring slid quietly out of the dinner party rotation. Today, nobody under 60 has tasted one. The dish belongs to the era when sophistication was measured by how cleanly something slid out of a copper mold. She kept the seeds in envelopes in a shoebox on the top shelf of the pantry, and every envelope had a name written in pencil: Half Runner, Turkey Craw, Greasy Cut Short, October Bean, names that never appeared in any catalog because they had been passed between neighbors and kin for so long that nobody remembered where they started. Saving seed was automatic. You let the best pods dry on the vine, shelled them out in October, and stored them somewhere cool and dark until spring. The varieties were adapted to that specific hillside, that specific altitude, that specific soil, refined by 100 growing seasons into something no commercial seed company could replicate. When the old gardeners died, the seeds often died with them, tossed out by children who did not know what was inside those envelopes. Chef Travis Milton now grows over 100 rare Appalachian varieties at his restaurant in Bristol, Virginia, collected from mountain old-timers before the last of them stopped planting. Every seed he saved is a voice that almost went silent. Number 20, creamed eggs on toast. You hard-boiled half a dozen eggs, peeled them, and chopped them into rough chunks. Then you made a white sauce in a saucepan, the same one you used for everything else. Butter, flour, and milk, stirred until it thickened. You folded the chopped eggs into the sauce and spooned the whole thing over slices of toast on a plate. Some families called it goldenrod eggs because of the color. Others just called it eggs on toast and moved on. The meal cost almost nothing and took 15 minutes. It showed up on Friday nights in Catholic homes and on any night the grocery money had run thin. You added salt and pepper and maybe a few canned peas on the side, and that was dinner. Nobody remembered it fondly. Everybody ate it. Before the stain set, she was already reaching for the yellow bar. Fell's Naphtha soap had been sold in American grocery stores since the 1880s, and by the 1930s it was on the shelf of nearly every Appalachian laundry porch. Not because anyone advertised it to mountain families, but because it worked when nothing else came close. The trick was to get it wet and work it in while the fabric was still damp, rubbing the bar directly into the grass stain or the grease spot in tight circles until the fabric warmed from friction and the stain started lifting. Children ran in from the field trailing red clay and muddy knees, and she didn't reach for a bucket. She reached for the bar. A single bar cost about 9 cents in the 1940s. You can still find it today on the bottom shelf of the laundry aisle, wrapped in the same yellow paper, doing the same work. Most people walk right past it. Number 20, peanut butter crackers and canned soup. Saltine crackers spread thick with peanut butter alongside a bowl of whatever canned soup was sitting in the pantry. Chicken noodle, vegetable beef, cream of mushroom heated with water instead of milk because the milk was saved for morning cereal. The crackers crunched, the soup was hot, and together they filled you up just enough to get through the evening without feeling empty. This was not a dinner anyone bragged about or wrote on a recipe card. But it showed up on kitchen tables across the country more often than pot roast or meatloaf ever did. The peanut butter stuck to the roof of your mouth and the soup warmed you from the inside, and together they kept families fed on the nights when fed was the only thing that mattered. Hog Killing Day was the most important day on the mountain calendar. The first hard freeze of late autumn when families gathered before dawn to slaughter, butcher, and preserve every part of the pig that could be salted, smoked, or rendered. Cracklin bread came from that day, specifically from the cracklins left behind after pork fat was rendered into lard in a massive iron kettle over an open fire. The cracklins, crisp, golden bits of fried-out pork skin and fat, were stirred directly into cornbread batter and baked in a cast-iron skillet greased with the fresh lard. The bread came out dense, rich, studded with pockets of crunch, and flavored with a porky depth no other cornbread could touch. Through the 1930s and 40s, families who kept hogs made cracklin bread only in the weeks following the kill, when the cracklins were freshest. When families stopped keeping hogs, the cracklins disappeared, and with them the bread that only tasted right made from a pig you raised yourself. Fried cabbage and onions was the meal that turned scraps into a feast. You started with whatever you had: a small head of cabbage, a tired onion, and the last spoonful of bacon grease from breakfast. Toss it all into a cast-iron skillet and let it fry until the edges browned and the smell filled the house. There was no recipe written down, just instinct and a good ear for the sound of sizzling vegetables. This dinner showed what made hillfolk cooking special: the ability to turn nothing into something worth sitting down for. It was hearty, smoky, and comforting, the kind of dish that could hush an empty stomach and still leave leftovers for breakfast. Paired with a hunk of cornbread or a slice of salt pork, it reminded everyone that flavor did not come from money. It came from patience. Sometimes the simplest meals were the ones that made life feel rich. Number 21. Cat head biscuit with sorghum. A biscuit the size of a cat's head, made from self-rising flour, lard, and buttermilk, baked at 450 until the top is the color of a deer hide. Split it open while it is still hot enough to burn a thumb. A spoon of dark sorghum molasses goes inside, and the molasses melts into the crumb and runs down a finger. Loyal Jones wrote that in the southern mountains, the cathead biscuit with sorghum was supper for any man or woman alone in the house, and Joseph Dabney recorded the same dish across the smokehouse counties of East Tennessee. The recipe makes 4 biscuits at a time, 3 for now, 1 for breakfast. A jar of dark Tennessee sorghum lasts a single person an entire winter. The sweetness is mineral and almost bitter at the back of the tongue, nothing like store syrup, and a single biscuit fills the plate without crowding it. Number 12, pressing raw apple cider and selling it off the tailgate. In the fall, a Hill family backed the wagon up to the orchard, ground the windfalls in a hand mill, and screwed down the press until the sweet, cloudy juice ran into the jugs. They sold it fresh by the roadside, unheated and unfiltered, the way every cider was for 200 years. That open sale is now hemmed in by federal rule. The Food and Drug Administration's Juice HACCP regulation requires processors to treat cider with a step that kills 99.9% of harmful bacteria, and any jug that skips that step must carry a stark printed warning that the product was not pasteurized and may sicken children and the elderly. The reason was a string of deadly E. coli outbreaks traced to raw cider. So the foggy autumn jug a family once handed over for pocket change now answers to the federal label law. Crackling cornbread with cane syrup was Christmas side that elevated simple cornbread into something rich and celebratory. The cracklings, crispy bits of rendered pork fat left from lard making, were mixed into cornbread batter before baking, creating pockets of crunchy, porky richness throughout. The bread baked in cast iron until crusty outside and tender inside, its top golden and inviting. Served with dark cane syrup drizzled over warm slices, this combined savory and sweet in ways that defined mountain eating. In rural communities, crackling cornbread meant using every part of the hog, transforming scraps into celebration. The cracklings added protein and flavor that plain cornbread lacked, while cane syrup provided sweetness families couldn't always afford. This was Christmas abundance created from what others might discard, proving mountain cooks knew how to make luxury from nothing. Number 15, the sorghum and butter biscuit. Sorghum molasses was the sweetener of the southern mountains long before white sugar became affordable. Families grew sorghum cane in small plots, cut it in the fall, and pressed the stalks through a horse-drawn mill. The juice ran into an evaporator pan set over a wood fire and cooked down into a thick, amber syrup with a flavor deeper and more complex than honey. You split a hot biscuit, spread butter on one side and a heavy pour of sorghum on the other, and pressed them together. The butter and the sorghum mixed into something rich and golden that ran down your fingers if you were not careful. Every country store in Kentucky and Tennessee sold sorghum in mason jars through the 1960s. Today it is a specialty item that costs $8 a jar. For 100 years, it was the cheapest sweet thing in the hills. Number 24, cooking 3 meals from one Sunday chicken. Cooking 3 suppers off one bird was the rhythm of every hillbilly Sunday. One roasting hen carried Sunday dinner, Monday soup, and Tuesday pot pie. The bird went into the oven with sage and onion until the leg pulled clean from the joint. Monday morning, the carcass simmered into stock on the wood stove rim. Tuesday, the leftover meat went into the broth with biscuit dough rolled into dumplings. 1 bird, 3 suppers, 11 plates, and the bones still make the broth in your kitchen tonight. Number 8, pulled taffy. This was not a candy. This was an evening. A big family with no radio and no visitors on a cold January night would cook a pan of sorghum and sugar to the soft ball stage, pour it out onto a buttered marble slab, let it cool just enough to handle, and then pair off, greased hands to greased hands, and pull. 2 people at a time stretching the hot, soft candy across the kitchen between them, folding, stretching again, until the dark brown of the sorghum turned pale gold, almost cream. An hour of pulling, an hour of laughing. The taffy was cut into squares with kitchen shears, wrapped in twists of waxed paper, handed out to the cousins. A taffy pull was how a family in Letcher County spent an entire Saturday night in 1949 without spending a nickel. Half the courtships in that hollow started over a pan of taffy. Sweet potatoes were delicate, too sensitive to cold for the root cellar, too moisture-prone for the straw and dirt method that kept white potatoes sound. So the women wrapped each one individually in newspaper or brown paper, stood them upright in wooden barrels, and stored the barrels indoors, in a back room near enough to the chimney to stay above freezing, but cool enough to prevent sprouting. May Rainey of Western North Carolina said wrapping was not optional. One bare sweet potato touching another could start a chain of soft rot that ruined the whole barrel in a week. Done right, they lasted into March. Baked whole in the fireplace ashes, split open with butter, they were the closest thing to dessert most mountain children tasted between October and Easter. Number 13, pot roast with Lipton onion soup mix. A 4-pound chuck roast browned in a Dutch oven, topped with a packet of Lipton dehydrated onion soup mix, a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom, and a splash of beef broth, then braised in a 325 oven for 3 hours. Carrots and potatoes piled around it for the last hour. Lipton printed the recipe on the back of every box from the early 1960s on, and Sunday dinner from Bangor to Bakersfield smelled the same because of it. Drive through a small town in Iowa at 4 on a Sunday and you would smell chuck roast through every screen door. The roast came out of the oven at 5. The family ate at 6. And the leftovers became hash on Tuesday. By the late 1990s, busy parents had switched to crock-pots and roasted chickens. The Sunday roast moved to the Yankee Candle aisle as a scent. You can still buy the Lipton packet at any grocery store in the country. The packet outlived the Sunday it was meant for. Baking sorghum was an all-day production that smelled sweet enough to pull you off the road. The cane stalks were stripped by hand, fed through a horse-drawn press that squeezed the juice out in a thin green stream, and that juice was boiled down in a long, shallow copper pan over a wood fire, stirred constantly for hours while the water evaporated and the liquid turned from pale green to deep amber. One misstep with the heat and the whole batch scorched. The person stirring had to know the color, the way the bubbles changed shape, the exact moment to pull the pan. Sorghum was the only sweetener most mountain families could afford. White sugar was a store-bought luxury. A gallon poured over hot biscuits with butter could make a cold morning feel like a holiday. That same gallon now costs $25 at a specialty food shop, bottled with a label that says artisan on it, as if the word adds something the sorghum does not already have. Number 9. Baked spaghetti. You boiled the noodles, browned ground beef with onion, stirred in a jar or a can of tomato sauce, and mixed the whole thing together in a baking dish. Then you covered the top with shredded cheddar or whatever cheese was in the refrigerator and baked it until the cheese melted and the edges turned crispy. It was not Italian. No Italian grandmother would have recognized it. But it was everywhere in the American Midwest and South by the 1950s, and it solved a problem that regular spaghetti could not. It held together on a plate. You could cut it into squares and serve it like a casserole, and the leftovers reheated the next day without turning into mush. Children who refused spaghetti from a pot would eat it from a baking dish without a word of protest, because the cheese on top changed everything. The sprinkler lived on the windowsill above the ironing board. A cork stopper fitted with a perforated aluminum head pushed into the neck of a soda bottle filled with plain water. You shook it over the fabric in slow passes before the iron came down, distributing moisture evenly so the cotton relaxed under the heat without scorching. The goal was damp, not wet. The way bread dough feels just before it rises, the fabric supple but not dripping. Steam irons made the sprinkler unnecessary, but in the years before them, and in plenty of houses well into the early 1960s, that cork and bottle contraption was the difference between a shirt that looked pressed and a shirt that looked like someone had ironed it in a hurry. Hardware stores sold the cork head for a few cents in the 1950s. A patient husband could make one from a cork and a thimble in an evening. She kept hers on the windowsill long after the steam iron came. It had been her mother's first, and then hers, and the bottle was the same one. Number 6. Rice and leftover gravy. White rice cooked in a pot, topped with whatever gravy was sitting in the refrigerator from a previous meal. Chicken gravy, beef gravy, tomato gravy saved from breakfast, it made no difference. The gravy had the flavor, the rice had the volume. Together they made a dinner that took about 15 minutes and used nothing that was not already in the kitchen. In Southern households, this meal was so common and so ordinary that it barely registered as a decision anyone consciously made. You cooked rice because rice was cheap and fast, and you poured gravy over it because the gravy was already there waiting to be used before it went bad. The rice stretched whatever was left of that gravy into a full serving, and the bowl hit the table hot and heavy enough that nobody asked what else was for dinner. None of those women worked from a recipe card or a cooking show. They opened whatever was in the pantry, stretched it as far as it would go, and put a full plate in front of every chair at the table. If one of those dinners brought a kitchen back to you, a grandmother standing at the stove, the pop of grease in a skillet, a table set with mismatched plates, write that name down in the comments before it fades for good. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one.